Hello everyone, and welcome to another amazing story. What if the Wolf Primarch was in Game of Thrones? This amazing story was written by Ace Gaming. Please support them. Don't forget to like, sub, and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. 297 AC, Winterfell. Jon. The soft crunch of snow underfoot and the sharp tang of frost in the air were constants in Jon Snow's life, as familiar to him as his own shadow. Winterfell, with its towering gray walls, steaming hot springs, and ancient godswood, was more than just a home to him. It was his world, the place where his identity was both forged and confined. The snow-covered courtyards, the solemn faces of the dire wolf statues, the sprawling halls warmed by roaring fires, all of it was etched into his heart as deeply as the truth of his bastardy. Jon had learned early in life that Winterfell, for all its strength and grandeur, held invisible walls for him, boundaries that kept him apart from the family he loved. Bastardy wasn't something worn on the skin, a visible mark others could see and understand. It was far subtler and yet far heavier, an ever-present weight in his chest, an unspoken truth that turned whispered words into accusations and sideways glances into daggers. No matter how deeply he yearned to belong, there was always something just out of reach, an intangible barrier that reminded him he wasn't truly a Stark. Yet for all that, his love for his family burned as fiercely as the great hearth in the great hall. He loved them fiercely, wholly, even when the specter of his name loomed like a shadow between them. Robb Stark, the eldest true-born son, was the brother Jon admired most. If ever there was a Stark meant to lead, it was Robb. With his auburn hair and piercing gray eyes, he was the very image of their father, Eddard Stark. Jon often felt like a pale reflection standing beside him, a shadow to Robb's son. Where Robb was strong, noble, and charismatic, Jon felt himself lacking, a lesser mirror. Robb had a confidence that seemed woven into his very being, as if he had been born knowing his place in the world. He carried himself with the quiet assurance of one destined to lead Winterfell, a boy who would one day grow into a man fit to wear the mantle of Warden of the North. And yet, Robb never made Jon feel lesser. In the training yard, they sparred endlessly, wooden swords clashing under the sharp northern winds. Robb fought with a natural strength and power, every strike brimming with raw energy. Jon, in contrast, relied on precision, his movements calculated and deliberate. Their contests were battles of will as much as skill, each pushing the other to improve. Robb's laughter rang clear whenever he landed a blow, and Jon couldn't help but laugh too, despite the sting of defeat. Their bond was deep, built on years of shared trials and triumphs, and Jon cherished every moment of it. But it was Leman, the brother closest to Jon in spirit and heart, who stirred the most complex emotions within him. Leman was everything Jon longed to be. Where Jon felt like a shadow lingering in the periphery, Leman was a roaring bonfire, impossible to ignore. With his wild laughter, mischievous grin, and boundless energy, Leman brought life and warmth wherever he went. He was charismatic, daring, and unrelenting, a force of nature who seemed destined for greatness. And he bore that destiny with ease, as if it were a mantle made for him alone. Leman was known as the Kraken Slayer, the youngest knight of the age, a warrior undefeated with sword or axe. He fought with a ferocity and skill that seemed almost otherworldly, as if battle were his natural state. Jon had watched him time and again, awestruck by the sheer grace and power with which he moved. Even as a boy, Leman had the presence of a legend, someone born to carve his name into the annals of history. Standing beside him, Jon often felt small, a pale imitation of the greatness that Leman exuded so effortlessly. And yet, Leman never treated Jon as anything less than an equal. To Leman, Jon was not a bastard or an outsider. He was a brother, a member of the pack, a companion in countless adventures around Winterfell. Together they had raced through the godswood, hunted in the frosted woods, and scaled the walls of the castle when no one was looking. They sparred as fiercely as they laughed, testing each other's limits with every clash of wooden blades. Leman's wild grin and encouraging words pushed Jon to fight harder, to believe, even if only for a fleeting moment, that he could be worthy of standing at his side. But that belief always crumbled in the quiet moments, when Jon was alone with his thoughts. No matter how fiercely Robb and Leman loved him, No matter how many times they treated him as a true brother, Jon couldn't shake the nagging sense that he didn't deserve it. Robb was the future of Winterfell, Leman a knight destined for glory, and Jon was just Jon, a bastard, a nobody with nothing but his name. He couldn't help but feel that their loyalty and love, no matter how genuine, were wasted on someone like him. He often wondered if they saw the tension he felt, the unspoken pain that gnawed at him like a wolf on a bone. Did Robb notice the way Jon's smile faltered when their father spoke of duty and legacy? Did Leman sense the tightness in Jon's voice when he spoke of his dreams? If they did, neither ever let it show. They stood beside him, unwavering, as if their bond were unbreakable. Jon knew in his heart that Robb and Leman would make fine lords, men worthy of their father's legacy. Robb, with his quiet strength and noble heart, and Leman, with his boundless courage and unyielding spirit. They would lead with honor and inspire loyalty in all who followed them. The thought filled Jon with both pride and an aching sorrow. He was proud to call them his brothers, to stand in their shadow and witness their greatness. But he couldn't help mourning the life he might never have, the name he might never earn. He loved them fiercely as he envied them, and that love was a constant ache, a reminder of what it meant to be Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell. Sansa was the sibling Jon understood the least. She was a stark contrast to everything he associated with the North, where the land was harsh, unyielding, and cold. She was warm, graceful, and endlessly fascinated by beauty. She carried herself with an elegance that seemed almost foreign in Winterfell, a delicate flower blooming amidst a forest of iron and snow. Her laughter was soft and musical, her movements poised and deliberate, as though she were born to walk the marble halls of some southern castle rather than the cold stone corridors of Winterfell. Sansa dreamed of a world Jon could hardly fathom, a world of chivalry and courtly love, where knights in shining armor fought for the honor of their ladies, and songs of romance and valor filled the air. Jon, for all his admiration of duty and honor, found her dreams naive. He knew the South through their father's grim stories, a place where smiles hid daggers and oaths were as fleeting as the summer sun. He didn't begrudge Sansa her fantasies, but he couldn't help feeling they were illusions destined to break against the harsh realities of the world. For her part, Sansa seemed to view Jon with polite indifference. She rarely spoke to him unless prompted, and when she did, her words were measured, her tone devoid of warmth or hostility. It wasn't cruelty. Jon doubted Sansa was even capable of that, but a kind of detachment, as though he were merely a figure on the edge of her vision, present but inconsequential. She called him Jon Snow, never just Jon, her voice carrying a subtle distance that made him feel every inch the bastard. Jon didn't blame her for it. Sansa was the Lady of Winterfell in every sense that mattered, the first and favored daughter of the Stark family. She was the jewel of the North, admired by all who met her. Her auburn hair, so like her mother's, caught the sunlight like polished copper, and her blue eyes held a softness that made others want to shield her from harm. Even the grizzled men of Winterfell's guard softened in her presence, their harsh northern accents gentling as they spoke to her. Sansa was a vision of everything noble and beautiful in House Stark, and Jon's existence, his bastardy, was a stain on that perfect image. He suspected she saw him as a shadow, a reminder of the imperfections that lurked behind the Stark name, though she was too well-mannered to ever say it aloud. Despite this unspoken distance, Jon felt a fierce need to protect her. She might never see him as more than her bastard half-brother, a figure perpetually on the periphery of her life, but that didn't matter. Sansa was family, and that was enough. He had seen the way she lit up a room, how her laughter could chase away even the darkest of moods. She was the heart of Winterfell, a source of warmth in the unrelenting cold of the North, and Jon swore silently to himself that he would do whatever was necessary to keep her safe. Of all her siblings, it was Leman she adored most. The bond between them was undeniable, a connection deeper and more intricate than any Jon shared with her. She spent more time with Leman than she did with even their mother, Lady Catelyn, and Leman seemed to treasure her above all others. He doted on her endlessly, a knight in practice if not in title, indulging her whims with a devotion that bordered on reverence. It was Leman who helped her with her lessons, Leman who taught her to ride and even, in secret, to fight. It was a surprising thing to see Sansa wield a blade, her movements tentative at first, but growing sharper under Leman's patient instruction. Her elegance extended even to the way she fought, graceful, precise, and deceptively strong. For Sansa, Leman was a figure of unshakable strength and boundless kindness. Where others might have dismissed her dreams as childish, Leman listened with genuine interest, his dark eyes gleaming as she recounted tales of gallant knights and noble ladies. He encouraged her to dream, even as he tempered her idealism with lessons in pragmatism. Sansa adored him for it, and Jon couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. Still, Jon couldn't deny the parallels between Sansa and the southern tales she loved so much. Sansa's beauty wasn't the soft fragility of a flower, but the radiant strength of the aurora, vibrant and untouchable. She had a duality to her, a capacity for gentleness and ferocity. She might have adored songs of knights and courtly love, but there was steel in her spine, a strength that had yet to be tested. Jon believed in that strength, even if she didn't see it in herself yet. She might never look at him with the same affection she reserved for Leman, but Jon didn't care. Sansa was family, the heart of Winterfell, and no matter the distance between them, he would protect her with everything he had. Whether she saw him as her brother or not, Jon swore to himself that she would never face the world's cruelty alone. He would be her shadow, unseen but unwavering, a shield against the storms to come. Arya, on the other hand, was his kindred spirit. Where Sansa embodied grace and beauty, Arya was fire and fury, a wild thing untamed by the expectations of noble life. She had no patience for Sansa's courtly dreams or the rigid roles imposed on her as a highborn girl of Winterfell. Arya balked at the idea of embroidery and lessons in proper etiquette, often fleeing the maesters and septas who tried to mold her into something she was not. Instead, she found her joy in the freedom of the open woods, the thrill of running through the castle's hidden passages, and the sharp, clean weight of a blade in her hand. Arya treated Jon with the same irreverent affection she showed to everyone she cared for. She never looked at him through the lens of his bastardy, never weighed him against the silent judgments of their mother or the expectations of their house. With Arya, there was no pretense, no veiled pity or quiet condescension. She loved him as he was, and in her company, Jon felt truly at ease, free from the shadow that seemed to follow him everywhere else. To Jon, Arya was everything he liked about Leman without the weight. Jon loved her for it, fiercely and without hesitation. He could see himself in her defiance, in the way she refused to let the world dictate who she was or who she would become. Arya was all sharp angles and stubbornness, a force of nature bound by neither propriety nor expectation. She laughed at rules and scoffed at the idea of tradition, a trait that often earned her disapproving glares from Lady Catelyn and sighs of exasperation from Maester Luwin. But Jon and Leman didn't see her wildness as a flaw. To them, it was a kind of strength, a refusal to bow to the constraints that sought to cage her spirit. They spent countless hours together, more often than not getting into trouble. Arya delighted in testing the limits of Winterfell's boundaries, her and Leman dragging Jon along on their escapades with wide grins that promised mischief. They explored the ancient Godswood, racing through its quiet stillness until their breath came in sharp gasps, the sound of their laughter ringing out amidst the towering weirwoods. Arya always won those races, her feet swift and sure, though Jon was never far behind. And Leman always made sure to be last, even if Jon intentionally slowed down or entirely stopped. When they weren't running or climbing, they sparred. Arya wasn't satisfied with wooden swords and training stances. She wanted to learn how to fight, truly fight, and rather surprisingly Jon was her favorite teacher instead of Leman. Even though he never could figure out why she chose him over Leman, he was nonetheless grateful for it. He admired her determination, the way her small frame seemed to vibrate with energy as she practiced strike after strike, her brow furrowed in concentration. Though she was smaller and less disciplined than her brothers, she made up for it with sheer tenacity. She fought like a wolf cub learning to use its teeth, unrelenting and eager, and Jon couldn't help but be proud of her progress. Bran was curiosity embodied, a boy whose mind seemed to race faster than the northern winds, always chasing the next question, the next story, the next adventure. From the moment he could speak, his endless stream of inquiries filled the halls of Winterfell, his voice a bright and eager counterpoint to the solemn stillness that often characterized the Stark home. Jon admired his younger brother's insatiable thirst for knowledge, the way he seemed determined to understand the world around him, even if it meant pestering Maester Luwin until the old man chuckled and surrendered another lesson. Bran didn't see Jon as a bastard. He didn't see the invisible line that set Jon apart from the rest of the family. To Bran, Jon was simply his brother, someone to listen to his stories, answer his questions, and, when he was lucky, carry him on his shoulders to reach the highest books in the Maester's library. Bran's acceptance was pure and unself-conscious, free of the awkwardness that sometimes clouded Jon's interactions with the others. It wasn't that Bran ignored Jon's bastardy. It was that it never occurred to him that it should matter. Jon found himself protective of Bran, perhaps more than any of his other siblings. There was something about Bran's boundless energy, his unguarded enthusiasm, that made Jon want to shield him from the harsher realities of the world. Bran was innocent in a way that felt rare and precious in the North, where life was often as unforgiving as the winters that blanketed the land. Jon knew that Bran's curiosity was both his greatest strength and his greatest danger. As the boy grew older, his adventures became bolder, his climbs higher, and his questions more daring. Jon worried about Bran's love of climbing most of all. The sight of his younger brother scaling Winterfell's ancient walls, scrambling up towers and darting across rooftops, sent a knot of unease twisting in Jon's stomach. Bran was fearless, and that was what frightened Jon the most. He would call out warnings, sometimes chasing after Bran in vain attempts to coax him down. Bran would only laugh, his blue eyes sparkling with a mixture of mischief and confidence. "Don't worry, Jon," he'd say, perched precariously on some ledge. "I won't fall." But Jon worried all the same. He envied Bran, too, though he would never have admitted it aloud. Bran's world was still wide open, filled with possibilities and dreams untainted by the weight of duty or the shadow of bastardy. He lived in a world where knights in shining armor still rode to the rescue, where dragons might still sleep beneath the mountains, and where the edge of the map wasn't a barrier but an invitation. Bran's questions, often fired off in rapid succession, had a way of pulling at Jon's own long-buried dreams. "What's beyond the wall, Jon? Do you think there's anything past the end of the world? Would you go there if you could?" Jon would smile, sometimes ruffling Bran's hair, but he didn't always have an answer. Bran's wonder reminded Jon of questions he'd long since stopped asking himself: what he wanted, who he wanted to be, and whether there might be a place for him beyond Winterfell's walls. It wasn't just that Bran dreamed so freely. It was that he dreamed without hesitation, without doubt. It was a kind of courage Jon wasn't sure he possessed. Bran's love of stories only deepened Jon's admiration. The boy devoured every tale Maester Luwin told him, from the songs of the first men to the exploits of legendary knights. He would sit cross-legged in the library or the godwood, his eyes wide with wonder as the Maester or old Nan recounted histories and myths. Jon often joined him, leaning against a tree or a wall, content to listen to Bran's eager retellings. "Did you know the children of the forest could make trees talk?" Bran once asked, his voice brimming with awe. "Do you think they're still out there, Jon?" Jon would nod, indulging Bran's imagination, even when his own thoughts leaned toward the practical. Bran's stories weren't just entertainment. They were a window into a world where anything was possible, where the constraints of reality could be bent by the sheer force of belief. It was a world Jon couldn't help but envy, even as he admired Bran for inhabiting it so fully. In Bran, Jon saw both innocence and potential, a combination that made him fiercely protective. He wanted to keep Bran safe, to shield him from the harshness of the world for as long as he could. Yet he also knew that Bran's curiosity was too powerful to be contained. The boy would climb higher, question harder, and dream bigger with every passing day. And Jon, for all his worries, couldn't bring himself to hold him back. Instead, Jon did what he could to guide Bran, offering quiet support and steady encouragement. He taught him how to move quietly through the woods, how to find his footing on icy stones, and how to read the signs of the changing seasons. Jon wanted Bran to be prepared, not just for the physical challenges of the North, but for the moment when his dreams would inevitably collide with reality. Bran, in turn, gave Jon something he hadn't realized he needed: hope. In Bran's questions and stories, in his fearless climbs and endless dreams, Jon saw a glimpse of a future that wasn't defined by the past. He saw the possibility of something greater, something beyond Winterfell and the weight of his name. Maybe one day he too would do something to be worthy of standing beside his siblings and achieve something deserving of the unrestricted love his brothers showered him with. Rickon was a tempest, a whirlwind of boundless energy and innocence, too young to comprehend the complexities of the world that surrounded him, let alone the intricacies of family and lineage. He was still in the golden years of childhood, where the most pressing matters were whether the sun would shine tomorrow or whether the next meal would be roast venison or boiled mutton. To Rickon, Jon wasn't a half-brother, a bastard, or an outsider. He was just Jon, one of his brothers, someone to chase through the hallways of Winterfell, someone to wrestle with in the snow, and someone who could lift him high onto his shoulders like the great, strong giant Rickon imagined himself to be one day. Jon treasured this simplicity in Rickon. There were no expectations in Rickon's world, no questions about his blood or his place within the Stark family. The boy never saw Jon as anything other than an equal, a figure he could look up to, laugh with, and share his fleeting, childlike joys. Jon marveled at that, at how Rickon's understanding of the world hadn't yet been soured by the harshness of life in the North or the tangled webs of family politics that Jon himself had been born into. To Rickon, the world was still wide open, a playground of possibilities, and Jon, for his part, loved being a part of that world, being someone who could make Rickon laugh, make him smile, and give him a little bit of happiness amid the cold. But Jon also felt an acute sense of protectiveness when it came to Rickon. The boy was still so young, so unaware of the complexities of Winterfell's heavy legacy, or the challenges Jon faced as the bastard of the family. Rickon's laughter, that rare, pure light that seemed to radiate from him as he ran and tumbled through the halls, was a stark contrast to the somber mood that often hung over Winterfell. Jon wanted to preserve that laughter, that joy, for as long as possible, to shield Rickon from the darker truths of the world that Jon himself had already started to grapple with. He wanted Rickon to remain untouched by the harshness of the North, by the weight of responsibility and the sense of distance that Jon felt from the rest of the family. He wanted to protect him from the knowledge that the world could be a cruel, unforgiving place, at least for as long as he could. It wasn't just Rickon's innocence that Jon clung to. It was the boy's perspective on the world. Where Jon had become weighed down by the pressures of his name and his place, Rickon was free. His world was defined by laughter, games, and adventures that had no consequence beyond the fun of the moment. To see the world through Rickon's eyes, even for a moment, was to see a world full of hope and possibility, unmarred by the uncertainty that Jon carried like a constant shadow. Rickon's laughter was rare in Winterfell, a stark contrast to the fortress's solemn walls and the ever-present chill of the northern winds. In the halls of Winterfell, there were few sounds more precious than the sound of Rickon's carefree giggles, echoing off the stone walls. Jon could hear him now, somewhere off in the distance, his joyful shrieks as he dashed across the yard, or perhaps chasing after the wolves. Sometimes, when Jon was walking through Winterfell's ancient corridors, Rickon would run up to him, tugging at his sleeve, his face flushed from running, eyes bright with excitement. "Jon, Jon, watch me," he would say, and Jon would drop whatever he was doing, smile, and take a moment to watch his younger brother leap into some new, wild game, his laughter ringing through the halls. Jon had always known that this kind of innocence was fleeting. Winterfell, with all its beauty and its ancient, windswept halls, could not shelter them forever. The world outside would change them, shape them in ways they could not yet understand. Rickon, with all his wild energy and carefree spirit, would eventually grow older, just as Jon had. The boy would come to learn the complexities of the world, and Jon feared that, in the process, some of that joy, some of that light, would inevitably fade. But for now, Jon held on to these moments, these rare bursts of laughter that made Winterfell feel alive, despite its cold stone walls. He held on to the boy who saw him as simply Jon, his brother, and who never judged him for what he was or where he came from. Jon carried Rickon on his shoulders when the boy asked, and he chased him through the halls when he needed to, savoring the rare, fleeting moments of pure joy that made the harsh winters of the North feel just a little less cold. And perhaps, in the back of Jon's mind, there was a quiet fear that this was all too brief, that one day Rickon would no longer be a child, no longer the innocent, laughing whirlwind who filled Winterfell with his light. But Jon promised himself, as he watched Rickon's carefree form dart across the yard, that he would protect that laughter for as long as he could, even if he couldn't shield Rickon from the hard truths forever. For now, Rickon was still his little brother, and that innocence, like all the good things in life, was something Jon would hold on to fiercely. Eddard Stark, his father, was both Jon's greatest love and greatest source of pain, an enigma of quiet strength and profound distance. Jon had loved Ned Stark since his earliest memories, long before he understood the full weight of his father's name, his legacy, or his stoic sense of honor. To Jon, Ned was a figure of towering reverence, the embodiment of everything good in the world: honor, duty, fairness, and an unyielding sense of responsibility. There was no one more constant in Jon's life than his father, no one whose word was so deeply ingrained in his soul. His loyalty to his father was unwavering, as deep as the roots of the weirwood trees that stood in the godswood at Winterfell. But with that love came a sharp ache, a longing that Jon could never fully satisfy. For all that Jon admired his father, for all the affection he felt for him, there was an invisible boundary that separated them, an unspoken line that Jon could never cross. Ned Stark, as steadfast as the great walls of Winterfell, carried himself with a quiet, noble dignity, and there was a part of him that always remained out of Jon's reach. Ned was kind in his own way, yes, but it was a kindness that was reserved, tempered by the weight of his responsibilities as Warden of the North and head of House Stark. That kindness never reached deep enough to erase the distance between them, the unspoken awareness that Jon was not truly of his blood, not truly of the same lineage as his trueborn children. Jon often wondered, in the quiet of his heart, whether his very existence was a burden to his father, a stain on Ned's honor that could never be washed away. The thought twisted in Jon's chest like a thorn, sharp and painful. There were times when Jon would catch a fleeting glimpse of something in Ned's eyes, a flicker of something unspoken, something heavy, when Jon would try to reach out for affection or understanding. It was then that Jon would realize just how much of a shadow he truly was in his father's life. When Jon was younger, he would sometimes venture into the great halls of Winterfell, lingering near his father's study, hoping to catch some small moment of his attention. Jon admired the way Ned moved through his duties, the way he carried himself with the weight of the North on his shoulders, with all the pride and burden of House Stark's long and storied history. But even then, when Jon sought his approval, there was always that subtle barrier between them. Ned would greet him with his usual measured kindness, his voice firm but never unkind, but Jon could feel the space that stretched between them. Jon never dared to ask Ned about his mother. He had learned long ago that some questions were better left unspoken. The few times Jon had broached the subject in his youth, seeking some piece of the puzzle that was his past, he had seen the set of Ned's jaw tighten, his eyes darken, and his gaze grow distant. The silence that followed was thick with meaning. It was a silence that spoke of regret, of loss, and of something Jon was never meant to know. He learned quickly that there were boundaries in their relationship that could not, and should not, be crossed. He had tried once, when he was still a boy, to ask his father about her, about the woman who had given him life, the woman who Jon was told was not a Stark, but something else, something outside of the walls of Winterfell's ancient halls. But when he had asked, there had been a fleeting coldness in Ned's face, a moment of tension that hung in the air like a winter storm before it broke. Jon had quickly learned the cost of such questions. His mother, Jon knew, was a memory that Ned carried like a secret burden, a quiet sorrow that could never be spoken of, a shadow that hung over the Stark family like a curse. Jon never spoke of his mother again, but the absence of answers haunted him, the unanswered questions a gnawing emptiness he could not fill. Was his existence a reminder of some old failure, some mistake Ned had made long ago? Was his mother's memory something too painful for his father to revisit, a part of Ned's past he had locked away for his own peace? Jon didn't know, but he often wondered if his presence was a reminder of something that should have remained buried, of a past that could never truly be undone. Despite all of this, despite the distance between them, Jon yearned for his father's approval more than anything. It was a quiet hunger that never truly went away, no matter how many times Jon told himself that it didn't matter, that his father's opinion wasn't the only thing that defined him. But deep down, Jon knew it was. His father's approval, his love, were the things Jon had wanted since he could remember. He wanted to hear Ned say, even just once, that he was proud of him, that he was more than just a shadow in the halls of Winterfell, more than just a boy with a name that would never allow him to be truly equal to the rest of the Stark children. Jon saw the way Ned looked at Robb, at Sansa, and at Arya. There was something there, a warmth, a bond that Jon would never know. He wanted to be part of that, to share in that closeness, to feel like he belonged, like he was truly one of them. But instead, there was always that space between them, a space that Jon could never seem to bridge, no matter how hard he tried. His father loved him, Jon was sure of that, but in a way that was different, measured, restrained. There was love in Ned's eyes, yes, but it was tempered by something else, something Jon could never understand, something that kept him just a little too far away. In his heart, Jon would always strive for that approval, for that quiet acknowledgement from his father that he had earned his place in the world, that he was worthy. He had always wanted to be more than just Ned Stark's bastard, to be something more than the product of a secret that was never meant to be known. But no matter how much Jon longed for it, he could never escape the feeling that in Ned's eyes, he was a reminder of something that could never be fully accepted. That, in the end, was the greatest pain Jon would ever know. Catelyn Stark was a presence in Jon's life as stark and unyielding as Winterfell's ancient walls. She was not cruel, not openly, not in the ways that would have left scars visible to anyone but him. But her coldness toward him was as constant as the northern snow. Jon felt it in every glance, sharp and fleeting, in every clipped word spoken with just enough civility to mask the disdain beneath. It wasn't malice. It was something quieter, more insidious. Her disapproval lingered in the air around her like a chill, settling into the cracks of his confidence and filling them with ice. Jon avoided her whenever he could. The great hall of Winterfell was wide, and he had learned how to navigate it in ways that kept him far from her gaze. He had mastered the art of slipping into rooms unnoticed, of leaving before her shadow could stretch across the threshold. But avoidance could only do so much in a castle that was both his sanctuary and his prison. There were moments when he could not escape her presence, when the full weight of her silent judgment pressed down on him like a storm he could not outrun. Her disdain was not the sort that demanded words. It was in the way her eyes flicked past him as though he were a ghost, in the careful deliberation with which she would include his siblings in a conversation but exclude him. It was in the stiffness of her posture when he entered a room, in the moments when her politeness became so sharp it felt like a blade. She never raised her voice, never struck him down with cruel words. Lady Catelyn Stark was too proud for such vulgar displays. But her silence, her subtle rejections, cut deeper than any shouted insult. Jon didn't hate her for it. He didn't have it in him to hate her, even if he thought he should. He understood her reasons, even if they wounded him more deeply than he cared to admit. He was a living reminder of something she could not forgive, a betrayal she could never truly move past. Every time she looked at him, she saw not just Jon Snow, the boy who loved her children and would give his life for them without hesitation, but the specter of her husband's supposed infidelity. Jon didn't need anyone to explain it to him. He felt it in his bones, in the marrow of his existence. He was an intruder in her home, a blot on the honor of House Stark, and no matter how he tried, he would never be more than that in her eyes. He only wished it could be different. Jon longed for some sign, however small, that she could see him for who he was and not the circumstances of his birth. He had no desire to replace her children in her heart. He loved Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon too much for that. He only wanted to be accepted, to be seen as more than a reminder of pain and betrayal. But deep down, he knew it was a futile hope. Lady Stark's wounds were not the kind that healed, and he was not the kind of balm that could soothe them. Jon's life in Winterfell was a constant dance between love and longing, between belonging and exclusion. He loved his family fiercely, with a devotion so deep it often startled him. They were his anchor in a sea of uncertainty, the reason he endured the cold stares, the whispered words, the quiet slights that reminded him he was not truly one of them. He would have given anything for them, even his life, but that devotion came at a cost. For all his love, for all his loyalty, he knew Winterfell would never truly be his home. He felt it in the spaces between him and his family, in the moments when he watched his father place a hand on Robb's shoulder, or when Catelyn smiled at Arya with a warmth that would never be directed his way. That knowledge burned like frostbite, painful and unyielding. It gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night, when the castle was still and he was left alone with his thoughts. But it also steeled him. Jon had learned to endure, to carry the weight of his outsider status without breaking. He bore it with the same quiet determination that his father carried his own burdens, though Jon often wondered if Ned Stark understood just how heavy a weight it was. And yet, even in his solitude, there was hope, a flicker of something bright and dangerous that refused to be extinguished. He had heard the tales of the Night's Watch, of the men who took the black and left behind the names and titles that had defined them. Beyond the wall, they said, a man's past did not matter. Bastard or lord, it made no difference among the brothers of the Watch. There, a man could forge his own path, build a life unshackled by the circumstances of his birth. The thought of leaving Winterfell filled Jon with dread and yearning in equal measure. It was his home, the only place he had ever known, but it was also a place that could never fully embrace him. Perhaps, beyond the wall, he could find something he had always craved but never dared to name, a place where he belonged. A place where he could be more than a shadow, more than a secret, more than a reminder of a betrayal that wasn't his. It was a dream as cold and unrelenting as the northern winds, but it was a dream nonetheless, and it was enough to keep him moving forward. XXXX. Tywin Lannister. Casterly Rock. Tywin Lannister stood alone in the solar of Casterly Rock, his imposing figure framed by the soft, flickering light of a dozen candles. The room was a reflection of the man himself, grand, austere, and meticulously ordered. Its vaulted ceiling soared high above, supported by carved pillars of gold-veined marble, each one engraved with the sigil of House Lannister, the golden lion roaring in triumph. The walls were adorned with tapestries so ancient they seemed to breathe history, their intricate depictions of Lannister conquests and prosperity stretching back to the Age of Heroes. The faint scent of beeswax and parchment filled the air, mingling with the salty tang of the sunset sea. Outside, the waves crashed relentlessly against the cliffs below, their distant roar a constant reminder of the rock's unyielding strength. The Lord of Casterly Rock, Warden of the West, and former hand of the king moved with the deliberate grace of a predator as he paced the length of the room. His crimson and gold robes whispered softly against the polished stone floor, each step resonating with quiet authority. Tywin's face, sharp as a whetted blade, was a study in control, its angular features carved into a mask of stoic determination. Time had silvered his once golden hair, but his piercing green eyes remained as keen and unforgiving as the day he first took the reins of House Lannister. Those eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed none of the thoughts that churned within his mind, save for the occasional glint of intensity that could freeze even the boldest of men in their tracks. The Iron Throne was precarious, its foundations as unstable as the drunken fool who sat upon it. Robert Baratheon, once a mighty warrior and conqueror, had become a gluttonous shadow of his former self. Tywin had observed the king's decline with disdain, watching as Robert squandered the crown's wealth on an endless parade of tournaments, feasts, and whores. The realm's coffers, once overflowing with gold, had been drained to the point of collapse, leaving the iron bank of bravos circling like wolves scenting blood. Tywin's lip curled faintly at the thought. The Iron Bank was a dangerous creditor, its agents cold and unrelenting. The crown's debts were vast, its obligations mounting with each passing day. The young Robb Stark's discovery of fudged accounts and the intentional displacement of funds by the late Grand Maester Pycelle had momentarily slowed the bleeding. But it was too little, too late. The Iron Bank had already smelled weakness, and their retribution would be swift and merciless. Yet Tywin did not see the crown's weakness as a threat. He saw it as an opportunity. Weakness, after all, could be molded, manipulated, and turned to his advantage. And Tywin Lannister was a master of turning chaos into order, his order. He came to a halt before a large oak table dominating the center of the solar. Its surface was inlaid with a finely detailed map of Westeros, a testament to the craftsmanship of Lannister artisans. Rivers, mountains, and cities were etched with precision, their positions marked by miniature figurines representing the great houses. Golden lions stood proudly over the Westerlands, their dominance extending to key locations throughout the realm. Silver stags marked Baratheon strongholds, dire wolves represented the Starks in the north, and mockingbirds and roses symbolized the ambitions of the Vale and the Reach. Tywin's fingers hovered over the map, his mind weaving a web of possibilities and contingencies. Robert's reign would not last. Tywin had known this from the moment he permitted his daughter, Cersei, to marry the king. It had been a calculated move, one born not of love or sentiment, but of strategy. Cersei was his greatest piece on the board, beautiful, ambitious, and as ruthless as any Lannister should be. Through her, Tywin had secured an unshakable foothold in the capital, binding the fate of House Lannister to the Iron Throne. But alliances, Tywin knew, were as fragile as the men who forged them. Robert's health was deteriorating, his appetite for excess hastening his inevitable downfall. When the king fell, chaos would descend upon the realm. Tywin intended to ensure that it was a chaos he could control. The loyalty of Robert's brothers posed another question. Stannis Baratheon was cold, rigid, and utterly humorless, a man of unbending principles who would not hesitate to challenge any perceived illegitimacy. Renly, on the other hand, was charming and ambitious, though Tywin saw little substance behind the young lord's easy smiles. Either could become a threat to Lannister interests, but Tywin believed Stannis to be the greater danger. Men like Stannis were dangerous precisely because they could not be bribed or swayed. And then there was the matter of Cersei and Jaime. Tywin's lips pressed into a thin line at the thought of his twin children. Their illicit relationship was a stain on the Lannister name, one that Tywin had chosen to ignore, at least for now. The risks were considerable, but the benefits outweighed them. If the truth were to remain hidden, it would ensure that the bloodline of House Lannister, pure and untainted, would sit upon the Iron Throne after Robert's death. The bastards he had fathered across the realm, with their black hair and bright blue eyes, would pale in comparison to the golden-haired heirs of Cersei and Jaime. Tywin allowed the affair to continue, not out of any tolerance for impropriety, but because it served his long-term goals. Tywin leaned over the table, his hand pressing down on King's Landing. "The lion does not ask permission," he murmured to the empty room, his voice low and commanding. "We take what is ours." His mind turned over the intricate steps required to ensure the Lannister legacy remained unassailable. Robert would fall, either to his own excesses or through carefully placed whispers that Tywin would orchestrate. Stannis and Renly would be neutralized, their ambitions redirected or crushed outright. The North, under Eddard Stark, would remain isolated, its honor bound by tradition and duty. And when the realm descended into chaos, it would be House Lannister that emerged triumphant, its golden lion standing unchallenged amidst the ashes of lesser men. The sound of distant waves crashing against the cliffs beneath Casterly Rock was the only sound that filled the heavy silence in the solar as Tywin Lannister continued to deliberate over the threats to his family's dominion. His mind, sharp and methodical, sliced through the many obstacles before him, weighing their dangers and potential for manipulation. Eddard Stark, that stubborn wolf of the North, was a man of honor, one of the few things Tywin regarded as a fool's weakness. Honor, Tywin knew, was a malleable force. It could be twisted, bent, and shaped into a weapon, wielded against the very soul of those who believed too strongly in it. Stark's strength, such as it was, lay in his unyielding belief in duty and honor. Yet, as Tywin had long since learned, there was nothing so perilous as a man who clung to his principles in the face of ambition. Honor could drive a man to his doom. The North, vast and isolated, had always remained a semi-detached corner of the realm. Stark's loyalty to the crown was an arrangement rooted in honor, but it had never been as solid as he believed. In Tywin's eyes, The North's icy expanse was a cold land of potential rebellion, always waiting to turn its back on the realm when it suited them. If Stark remained focused on his harsh homeland, Tywin would let him be. But if drawn south, whether by duty to the crown or by ambition, Tywin would ensure that Stark's precious honor would become the very thing that caused his downfall. Stark's isolation was his strength and his greatest weakness, and Tywin intended to exploit it. But as Tywin's mind turned to the Stark family, two new hurdles had emerged, and they had names: Leman and Robb. Robb Stark, the eldest son of Eddard Stark, was a complete enigma, a mystery wrapped in a woolen cloak of northern pride. Robb had been little more than a shadow in Tywin's calculations, known primarily through fleeting reports from Cersei and the whispers of his spies. The boy had only truly captured Tywin's attention when he visited King's Landing a few years ago and exposed Pycelle's embezzlement, a move that, while inconvenient, was ultimately inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Tywin had smiled at the boy's naive desire for justice, his attempt to right a wrong that, in Tywin's view, was simply a game of men manipulating the system. What little Tywin knew of Robb Stark, an earnest but easily controlled young lord, did not concern him. Yet he knew Robb's strength would lie in the loyalty of the North and the barons there, a loyalty that could turn to a potent weapon if given the right circumstances. But Leman Stark, Robb's twin brother, was an entirely different matter. Tywin's fingers clenched into fists, his mind flashing back to the first time he had heard the name Leman Stark. The boy was no mystery. He was known to Tywin all too well, and what Tywin knew filled him with a burning, seething animosity. Leman Stark was a living weapon, an unstoppable force that Tywin could not control, a threat that would haunt him until the day he died. At the age of merely 8, Leman had slain multiple Ironborn raiders in a battle that should have been beyond his ability. He had single-handedly killed Lord Durstendrum, a seasoned warrior, in the most humiliating fashion, and taken Drum's sword, the Red Rain, a rare and revered Valyrian steel blade. Tywin had first dismissed the reports of the boy's deeds as exaggerated tales told by boastful soldiers. But then Ser Barristan Selmy, one of the finest knights to ever serve the realm, had confirmed the tale. Other seasoned warriors had spoken of Leman's ferocity and raw talent, and the truth of the boy's ability began to sink in. Tywin had learned to trust the judgment of men like Selmy, and if the great knight said the boy was a warrior of exceptional prowess, then Tywin had no choice but to accept it. It was then that Robert Baratheon, in his usual drunken folly, had proceeded to knight the child, ignoring all advice, including that of Eddard Stark himself, who had been deeply opposed to the idea. The North had no tradition of knighthood, yet Robert had acted on his whims and made Leman a knight in a fit of drunken bravado. Tywin's lips curled into a thin smile at the memory. Though he had always been one to take offense at Robert's excesses and foolishness, Tywin could not help but find a certain satisfaction in the chaos Robert had caused. Still, Tywin knew the North did not view knighthood as something to be bestowed upon their children, and Robert's actions had only deepened the divide between the North and the rest of the realm. But the greatest insult, the thing that truly ignited Tywin's fury, was Leman's brazen refusal of Tywin's offer. The boy had been invited to squire for Tywin himself or for Jaime, his most gifted son, but Leman had rejected it without hesitation. Worse yet, the boy had dismissed Tywin's offer of 1,000,000 gold dragons for the Red Rain, treating it as though it were no more valuable than a trinket. Tywin had offered the boy a fortune, a sum of gold that could make most men's fortunes last a lifetime, and yet Leman had scoffed at it. Tywin's anger had flared, but it was only a spark compared to what came next. Leman had taken the Red Rain, the legendary sword forged of Valyrian steel, and melted it down. He had tainted it, ruined it, and transformed the blade into two smaller swords made from a common alloy. A sacrilege, a mockery of everything the Lannisters stood for. Tywin's fingers flexed in rage as he remembered the reports of the boy's arrogance. Leman Stark was dangerous not just because of his martial prowess, though that alone made him a formidable foe. The boy was a symbol of everything Tywin loathed: stubbornness, defiance, and a pride that surpassed even his own. The fact that Leman had dared to defy him, to reject his offer and mock his authority, made Tywin's blood boil. But what infuriated Tywin most of all was that Leman had the potential to become the greatest warrior in Westeros. With his raw strength and untamed talent, Leman would one day be an unstoppable force. Tywin would not stand for it. His hand clenched tighter, the knuckles of his fingers white. Leman's existence had become an intolerable threat to his carefully laid plans. He had the potential to disrupt everything Tywin had worked for, his position, his power, and the destiny he had crafted for House Lannister. He could not allow the boy to grow unchecked. Leman would either submit to Tywin's control or be eliminated. Tywin's eyes flicked toward the map on the table, the golden lion of House Lannister gleaming in the light of the candles. His mind raced with schemes, possibilities, and contingencies. He would strike first. The Stark boy would be removed from the board before he could become a true threat. The time for subtlety was over. Leman would not have the chance to become the figurehead of a new northern rebellion. He would make sure of it. To the south, the Tyrells of Highgarden presented a challenge of a different kind, one of subtlety, diplomacy, and careful maneuvering. Their wealth was vast, rivaling that of House Lannister, and their lands were among the most fertile and populous in the realm. The bounteous fields of Highgarden supplied the capital with the finest produce. Their vineyards yielded wine that graced the tables of lords and kings alike, and their gardens, laden with blooms of every imaginable color, were the envy of the Seven Kingdoms. Highgarden was not only a heart of agriculture, but a seat of power in the Reach, an ancient region steeped in history, whose people were proud of their heritage and ever hungry for greater recognition. Mace Tyrell, the head of House Tyrell, was, in Tywin's estimation, an almost comically vain and bumbling lord, a man whose personal ambitions far exceeded his intellectual capabilities. A man obsessed with his own status and pride, Mace presented himself as a ruler of magnificence, but his weakness lay in his vanity. He was a man who loved the trappings of power, lavish feasts, grand processions, and the glittering adoration of his bannermen, but lacked the steely focus and strategic mind to wield it effectively. He was a man who surrounded himself with sycophants and flatterers, offering empty compliments to fuel his inflated sense of self-importance. Tywin often wondered how someone so utterly foolish had managed to maintain power over such a vast and prosperous land for so long. But the Reach was not so easily ruled, and Mace Tyrell's foolishness had been tolerated only because it was inconsequential compared to the true force behind House Tyrell, the matriarch, Olenna Tyrell. Olenna, known to those who respected her as the Queen of Thorns, was a woman of unmatched sharpness, her intellect a blade honed over a lifetime of courtly intrigue and political maneuvering. Tywin respected her, though he saw her as an old lioness, past her prime and yet still dangerous. Olenna's beauty had long since faded, replaced by a face lined with age and wisdom, but her mind remained as keen as the dagger she had so often used to cut through the web of political alliances. Where her son was a fool, Olenna was a genius, an individual whose cunning and foresight had helped secure the Tyrell's place at the top of the noble hierarchy. If anyone in House Tyrell could be considered a true adversary, it was her. But even in her advanced years, Olenna was a formidable force, her every word, every gesture calculated to shape the fate of the Reach and her family's power. Tywin had no illusions about her intentions. Olenna had been, and likely still was, a woman with designs on the Iron Throne. The Tyrells, like the Lannisters, had long dreamed of having their blood seated on the throne of Westeros. But while Tywin had cunningly maneuvered his way into a position of power, the Tyrells had been less successful, their ambitions thwarted time and time again by the prevailing tides of history. The Tyrells had once been on the periphery of power, watching with eager eyes as others fought for the crown, but their growing influence had made them a formidable faction in their own right. Tywin had no desire to let the Tyrells get any closer to his prize. It was clear to Tywin that the Tyrells needed to be placated or neutralized, one way or another. Their ambitions, if left unchecked, would certainly pose a threat to House Lannister. But there was no need to engage in an open conflict. The Tyrells had always been more adept at managing their ambitions through marriage alliances, their eyes always seeking a way to further their family's claims to power through strategic unions. Tywin was no stranger to this game. He, too, had used marriage to secure his house's place in the world. A union between House Tyrell and House Lannister could serve both to bind the Reach to his family's cause and to further his own interests in the capital. And there was, of course, the matter of Margaery Tyrell, the stunningly beautiful daughter of Mace Tyrell, whose allure had already captivated many of the great lords of the realm. Her beauty was unparalleled, her grace unmatched. Rumor had it that she was as much a political asset as she was a woman of extraordinary charm, capable of bending the wills of men with a single glance. Her youthful, captivating appearance could do much to sway the hearts of men, and that made her a potent tool in the delicate Game of Thrones. Tywin had heard much about her from his informants, from her soft-spoken manner to her ability to charm even the most difficult of men. She was a creature of allure, both in appearance and in personality, a young woman who seemed to possess all the qualities of a queen. To Tywin, it seemed almost inevitable that Margaery Tyrell would become the bride of his grandson, Joffrey. The Tyrells were hungry for power, and Tywin was more than willing to use their ambition for his own ends. If he could bind House Tyrell to his family through a marriage to his grandson, it would not only secure the Tyrells' loyalty to the throne, but also provide an opportunity to manipulate the situation to his advantage. A marriage between Joffrey and Margaery would secure the Tyrells' position at court and give them the semblance of power, but in reality, it would ensure that Tywin's influence remained the dominant force in the capital. He had already been in control of the power behind Robert's throne. Now it was time to control the power behind Joffrey's. As Tywin considered the possibility of a marriage alliance, he could not help but recognize the underlying danger the Tyrells posed. Olenna's sharp mind and ambition were not to be underestimated. If Tywin was to proceed with any plans involving the Tyrells, he would need to tread carefully. He would have to make sure that Margaery Tyrell's marriage to Joffrey was more than just a union of two houses. It would need to be a carefully constructed alliance, one in which House Tyrell's power would be contained and redirected, their ambitions harnessed to serve Tywin's own. A subtle hand would be required, a steady touch that could guide the Tyrells into a position where they could be used, but never allowed to grow beyond the sphere of influence that Tywin Lannister controlled. In the end, Tywin had little doubt that the Tyrells could be brought into the fold, but he also knew that they would need to be watched closely. Their ambitions would not be easily stifled, but with careful manipulation, he could ensure that their goals aligned with his own. And so, the plan began to take shape in Tywin's mind. A marriage alliance that would bind the Tyrells to the Lannisters and secure his family's dominance over the realm, all the while keeping the Tyrells' ambitions in check. It would be a long game, but it was one Tywin knew how to play better than anyone else. Tywin's gaze shifted southward, beyond the Reach, where the sun-drenched deserts and arid landscapes of Dorne lay, a land as unforgiving as it was proud. The people of Dorne were a mystery, enigmatic and fiercely independent, their ways as foreign to the rest of Westeros as the distant lands of the East. Tywin's thoughts on Dorne were complicated, filled with a deep understanding of their potential danger, tempered by a recognition of their strategic importance. For all of Dorne's history of defiance and insurrection, Tywin had long recognized that the land and its people could not be ignored. The Martells of Dorne had never fully accepted the rule of the Iron Throne. They were as stubborn and proud as the Starks of the North, but their loyalties were more complex. The Martells had bided their time ever since the last rebellion, in which they had suffered great losses, most notably the deaths of the last of their princes and their beloved princess, Elia, at the hands of the Lannisters during Robert's rebellion. The sting of that treachery had not faded with time. It had only festered and turned to bitter resentment. Dorne had been silent for many years following those events, but that silence was not peace. It was the calm before a storm. Tywin had never forgotten the day when he had received the news of Elia's brutal murder, nor the weight of the Martells' unspoken promise of revenge. The Dornish were slow to forgive, but they were not without honor. They could, in some respects, be as honorable as any noble house of Westeros. But that honor had a different shape, and it ran deeper than mere codes of conduct. The Martells' sense of justice was unyielding, and their pride was a fire that could not be extinguished. The Dornish were also dangerous because they had an entirely different approach to power, one that had less to do with wealth or prestige and more to do with the control of alliances, knowledge, and influence. Their methods of warfare were subtle, relying on poison, intrigue, and their notorious spies. While Tywin understood the brute force of war, the Martells knew how to play a different kind of game. It was a game that Tywin had never fully mastered, and that made them all the more dangerous. Dorne might not have the resources of the Reach or the North, but it possessed something equally powerful, the ability to strike at the heart of the realm without warning. And yet, despite their thirst for vengeance, Tywin knew that the Martells were not fools. They understood the importance of maintaining the status quo, even if they despised it. The Martells had their lands, their culture, and their pride. They were content to remain in the shadow of the Iron Throne, ruling their own people with a heavy hand but accepting the throne's authority in practice, if not in principle. To them, it was not about rebellion, but about maintaining their identity as a distinct people, not subject to the same rules as the rest of Westeros. Tywin had dealt with Dorne before, and he had learned to tread carefully in their waters. There was little love lost between House Lannister and House Martell, but Tywin was not one to allow personal animosities to cloud his judgment. Dorne was a kingdom unto itself, and while it posed no immediate threat to the stability of the realm, Tywin could not afford to allow its simmering resentment to grow into something more dangerous. If Dorne ever chose to rise against the crown, it would not be an open rebellion but a shadow war, one fought with whispered words, poisoned daggers, and the subtle shifting of alliances. But Tywin's mind was always calculating, always looking for ways to turn potential threats into opportunities. And in Dorne, there was an opportunity to secure peace, at least temporarily, through strategic marriage. Dorne's lust for revenge, while deeply ingrained, was not an immediate threat. It was a long-term festering wound. Tywin understood that in order to maintain peace, he had to address the root causes of their anger. The Martells were a family deeply connected to their own pride and to their legacy. Prince Doran Martell, the current ruler of Dorne, was a man of patience and calculation. He had learned to survive by keeping his hand close to his chest, waiting for the right moment to strike. His body, frail and weak, betrayed a man whose strength lay not in the sword but in his mind. Tywin could appreciate Doran's intelligence, and that was why, despite the history of animosity between their houses, Tywin could see a way forward. Doran Martell would never bend the knee to Tywin, nor would he ever forget the wrongs committed against his family. The Martells, Doran and Oberyn, would have to be removed. There was no other choice, and maybe down the line a few generations later, the rest of the Martells too. Tywin's thoughts, as always, returned to his family, his cursed, flawed, but undeniably useful family. The firelight flickered across his face, casting deep shadows that accentuated the lines of age etched into his features. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together, eyes narrowing in contemplation. His youngest son, Tyrion, was a source of constant irritation, a reminder of everything Tywin despised about the randomness of fate. Tyrion, the twisted dwarf who had brought shame upon the Lannister name simply by being born. He had the audacity to exist, to defy the expectations of Tywin's perfect lineage. That grotesque twist of fate, the failure of nature that had marred Tywin's otherwise flawless bloodline, had made Tyrion a living insult. Yet despite his loathing, Tywin could not deny the boy's brilliance. Tyrion had a mind sharp as a blade, quick-witted and sharp-tongued, and a cunning that often surpassed even his older siblings in its ruthless efficiency. These traits, though irksome, could be wielded like a dagger in the shadows. Tyrion's quick thinking, his skill in court politics, and his mastery of words had proven useful in the past, and Tywin knew that in the right circumstances, the dwarf could be a valuable asset. The dwarf's presence in the family was a constant reminder of Tywin's misfortunes, a cruel twist of fate he could never escape. But Tywin's sense of duty would not allow him to dismiss Tyrion, no matter how loathsome he found the boy. Family was duty, and duty, as Tywin well knew, demanded the use of every asset, even those as unpleasant as Tyrion. The boy was a disgrace, certainly, but his mind could be sharp enough to serve Tywin's purposes if wielded correctly. And that, Tywin thought bitterly, was what mattered most. Love was a luxury Tywin had abandoned long ago, ever since Joanna's death, the love of his life, the one woman who had ever truly mattered to him. The pain of her passing had long since hardened his heart. He had no room for tenderness or affection. His family was a tool, and the tools must be used. His gaze hardened as he turned his thoughts to Jaime, his golden son. A warrior like none other, the Kingslayer, the prodigy who had once been his pride and joy. Tywin's jaw clenched as he thought of Jaime, a golden lion chained by his own vows. Vows that Tywin found anathema to everything he believed in. The Kingsguard, the cursed vow of celibacy and service to the throne. How Jaime had squandered his potential by joining the Kingsguard, giving up his birthright and his future in favor of the king's service. That decision had been an insult to Tywin's legacy, one that he had never forgiven. It was a betrayal, not just of his name, but of everything Tywin had built. The Lannisters were meant to rule the Seven Kingdoms, not serve them. And yet, despite Jaime's foolishness, Tywin could not ignore the boy's talents. Jaime remained one of the greatest warriors in the realm, a weapon Tywin could wield when the time came. But that time had not yet arrived. Tywin still harbored a hope, a plan, even, that he could somehow free Jaime from the shackles of his oath. The Kingsguard had no place in the Lannister legacy. Jaime was meant to inherit Casterly Rock, to carry on the proud tradition of the Lannister line. Tywin's ambition for his son had always been so much greater than the honor of serving as a sworn knight. Tywin had invested too much in Jaime, too much of his own pride and his future, to let him remain bound by this foolish vow. Jaime would return to Casterly Rock, where he belonged. Tywin would see to it, even if it meant bending the rules of honor and tradition to break the vow that had been sworn. But as Tywin's mind shifted from the son he despised to the son he still hoped would fulfill his destiny, his thoughts turned to a threat that loomed on the horizon, one that he had been watching with a careful eye for some time. The Targaryens, Daenerys Stormborn and her brother, Viserys. They were little more than children now, exiles clinging to the fragile dreams of reclaiming the throne their ancestors had once ruled with dragons in hand. The sight of the Targaryen sigil still lingered in his mind, a reminder of the legacy of power they had once wielded. Tywin had no love for the Targaryens, nor any great fear of them, not in their current state. They were far from being a present threat, and for the time being, their claim was weak. Daenerys was a mere girl, no more than a wisp of a shadow of her ancestors, and Viserys, though ambitious, was little more than a petulant, spoiled child. He had no real power, only a broken legacy and the fragile hope that one day, somehow, the throne might be restored to his family. But even Tywin could not ignore the rumors. Whispers that came from the far east, from the lands across the narrow sea. Dragons. Not just any dragons, but dragon eggs. Ancient relics. The last vestiges of the Targaryen dynasty's once great power. The thought gnawed at Tywin, gnawed at him like a worm burrowing into his mind. Dragons were not mere myths or old tales. They had once burned whole cities to the ground, brought the Seven Kingdoms to heel under the Targaryen banner. And if those dragons were to return, if the blood of the dragon were to rise once again, it would be a power unlike anything the world had seen in centuries. Tywin could not allow that to happen. If the Targaryens were ever to return, they could tear apart everything he had built. The very idea of dragons once again taking flight over Westeros made his blood run cold, even if the creatures were still distant, still locked away in the far reaches of the east. He would not allow that threat to grow unchecked. If it meant breaking the Targaryens once and for all, so be it. Tywin would find a way to deal with them, as he had dealt with every other threat to his family's rule. The Targaryens would never regain the throne, not while Tywin Lannister still drew breath. He leaned over the map, his fingers pressing down on King's Landing. The capital was the key to everything. Control the Iron Throne, and the realm would follow. But to control the throne required more than swords and gold. It required fear, respect, and alliances forged in fire and blood. Tywin would see to it that House Lannister remained the wealthiest, the strongest, and the most feared family in Westeros. "We take what is ours," he murmured, his voice low but resolute. The lion does not ask permission. As the candles burned low and the waves roared outside, Tywin began to lay out his plans in meticulous detail. He would strengthen the crown's reliance on Lannister gold, ensuring that Robert and his court could not function without him. He would spread whispers, rumors that sowed discord among the great houses, pitting them against one another while the lions stood unchallenged. Marriage alliances would be negotiated, debts called in, and enemies crushed with swift, unrelenting force. The realm was a beast, unruly and wild, but Tywin Lannister was its master. And when the time came, he would unleash his lion's roar, reminding all of Westeros why the Lannisters were a family to be feared. King's Landing. In the heart of King's Landing, the bustling capital of the Seven Kingdoms, the tolling of bells echoed solemnly through the cobblestone streets, casting a pall of grief over the city. The resonant chimes mourned the death of Lord Jon Arryn, the esteemed hand of the king. The silent procession of the Silent Sisters, garbed in their customary gray robes, moved with reverence through the Red Keep as they prepared his lifeless body for burial. Their footsteps were a soft whisper against the stone floors, their presence a grim reminder of mortality. Queen Cersei Lannister stood by the window of her private chambers, her gaze fixed on the courtyard below. Her golden hair, a symbol of the proud Lannister lineage, shimmered in the dim light. The expression on her face was a mix of apprehension and determination. As the queen, she had seen many come and go in the treacherous political landscape of Westeros, but Jon Arryn's death stirred a deeper fear within her. Cersei's emerald eyes narrowed as she turned away from the window, her thoughts racing. She could not shake the gnawing suspicion that Jon Arryn had discovered something he should not have. The implications of such knowledge could be ruinous, not just for her, but for her entire family. She needed answers, and more importantly, she needed reassurance. She found her twin brother, Ser Jaime Lannister, lounging in armor-clad nonchalance within the chambers of the King's Guard. His golden hair, identical to hers, fell in casual disarray as he leaned back, a smug grin playing on his lips. His sword, a gleaming symbol of his prowess, lay within easy reach. Cersei's arrival stirred him from his relaxed state, though the amusement never left his eyes. "Jaime," she began, her voice low and urgent. "We have a problem." Jaime's brow arched, his curiosity piqued by the tension in her voice. "A problem? What now, dear sister?" "Jon Arryn," she said, stepping closer, her tone hushed yet insistent. "He knew something, Jaime. Something about us. I'm sure of it. And what if he told someone before he died?" Jaime's expression hardened for a moment, but it quickly melted back into a dismissive smirk. "If he knew the truth, and if he had told anyone, we'd be dead by now. The king would have seen to that. You worry too much." Cersei's frustration flared. "You don't understand. The timing of his death is too convenient. Someone could be lying in wait, ready to expose us when it suits them." Jaime rose from his seat, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll deal with it when the time comes. Until then, let's not let fear govern us. You're stronger than that." Cersei pulled away, her eyes narrowing. "You should be the hand of the king," she said abruptly, her tone laden with conviction. "You're the only one I can trust in that position." Jaime chuckled, shaking his head. "The hand of the king? That sounds like far too much work. I prefer the simplicity of my duties in the King's Guard. Politics is your game, not mine." Cersei's frustration boiled over. "You take nothing seriously, Jaime. This is our family's survival at stake." On the other side of the Red Keep, in the shadowed recesses of his chambers, Peter Baelish, Lord Littlefinger, leaned back in his chair. The flickering candlelight played across his calculating features as he surveyed the intricate web of intrigue he had spun. A sly, knowing smile curled his lips. The death of Jon Arryn was but a move in the larger game, and Littlefinger knew exactly how to play the pieces. He had whispered secrets into the right ears, set events in motion, and now he watched as the ripples spread, sowing chaos and confusion. To him, it was a symphony of power, and he reveled in its discordant notes. As the bells continued to toll, signaling the end of an era and the beginning of uncertainty, the players in the grand game of Thrones positioned themselves as a single raven began its flight towards the north. The north. In the vast, snow-draped expanse of Winterfell, the Stark family gathered in the training yard, a familiar scene of familial bonding and the honing of martial skills. Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, stood with his wife, Lady Catelyn Stark, watching their 10-year-old son, Bran, as he practiced his archery. The crisp winter air carried the sound of Bran's bowstring snapping, followed by the disappointing thud of an arrow missing its mark and soaring high over the wall. Beside Bran stood Leman, Ned's second-born son and twin to Robb, along with Jon Snow, Ned's illegitimate but dearly loved son. Both 17, the pair shared a bond that transcended their differing statuses. Leman, ever the supportive older brother, tried to guide Bran, but even he couldn't suppress his laughter when Bran's latest attempt sailed even further off course than the last. Jon, with his characteristic quiet humor, chuckled alongside Leman, their mirth infectious. Eddard, with his stern but loving demeanor, approached the group. His gray eyes twinkled with amusement as he gently chided Leman and Jon. "Let's not discourage your brother. Archery takes time and patience." Bran, though initially disheartened, found comfort in his father's words. "Keep at it," Eddard encouraged, placing a reassuring hand on Bran's shoulder. Even the best archers had to start somewhere. Nearby, Rickon, the youngest of the Stark children at 6, watched with wide-eyed fascination. His small frame was bundled against the cold, and his bright, curious eyes darted between his brothers. He admired them, eager to grow into his own role among the Stark legacy. Suddenly, a whoosh and a thud broke the moment as an arrow struck dead center of the target. All heads turned to see Arya, the 11-year-old Stark daughter, standing with a mischievous grin, holding a bow. She had left her needlework, abandoning Sansa, their 13-year-old sister, to join the boys. Arya had always been more inclined toward adventure and action, finding the traditional pursuits of noble ladies dull. Bran, initially stunned, quickly gave chase, laughing as he pursued Arya around the yard. Their playful banter and quick-footed antics brought smiles to the faces of their parents and siblings. Ned, Catelyn, Leman, and Jon watched the scene with a mixture of amusement and pride. The familial bonds of Winterfell were strong, a comforting warmth against the harsh northern winds. However, the lightheartedness was interrupted when a messenger approached Ned, delivering urgent news. A deserter from the Night's Watch had been found, a grave matter that demanded immediate attention. Ned's face grew solemn as he absorbed the news. His thoughts briefly flickered to Robb, his eldest son and Leman's twin, wondering where he was at that moment. Robb, meanwhile, sat in his office located in the refurbished First Keep, a symbol of Winterfell's enduring strength. The office, with its sturdy oak desk and shelves lined with ancient tomes, was a space where Robb often found solace and strategy. The flickering light of the hearth cast long shadows as he leaned over a letter that had arrived just minutes ago. The letter bore the seal of one of his spies in King's Landing, one of his ravens. The contents of the letter were grim. Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King, was dead. Robb's brow furrowed as he read and reread the letter, the weight of the news sinking in. Jon Arryn's death was no mere happenstance. It reeked of foul play, a calculated murder executed with precision. Yet, there was no proof, only the unsettling implications of a realm poised on the brink of chaos. Robb's thoughts turned stormy. He understood the fragile balance Jon Arryn had maintained. King Robert Baratheon, once a mighty warrior, had become a shadow of his former self, drowning in wine and the pleasures of the flesh. It was Jon Arryn who had held the realm together, ensuring the fractures did not widen into irreparable rifts. Now, with Jon Arryn gone, Robb foresaw a storm brewing on the horizon. The delicate peace that had kept the Seven Kingdoms united was now in jeopardy. The death of Jon Arryn would inevitably unravel the tenuous threads of stability, plunging the realm into chaos. As Robb sat in contemplation, the weight of his responsibilities bore down on him. He knew that the Stark family, with its ancient lineage and honor-bound duty, would be drawn into the coming strife. The question was not if, but when. The air was crisp as Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, prepared to ride out from the castle walls with a small retinue. The sun was just beginning to reach noon, shining brightly over the white landscape. Today, he would carry out a solemn duty, a task dictated by law and honor. A deserter from the Night's Watch had been found, a man named Will, and as an oath-breaker, his fate was sealed: execution. Joining Eddard were 4 of his sons, Robb, Leman, Jon, and Bran, as well as his ward, Theon Greyjoy. The Master-at-Arms, Roderick Castle, and his leading guard, Jory Castle, also accompanied them. The group rode in silence, the weight of the task ahead pressing heavily upon them. As they reached the execution site, a clearing beyond the castle's protective walls. The atmosphere grew even more somber. Will, the condemned man, stood waiting, his hands bound and his face pale but resolute. His eyes flicked nervously between the men before him, but he did not flinch as Eddard approached, carrying the ancestral Valyrian steel greatsword of House Stark, Ice. The blade gleamed ominously in the morning light, a stark reminder of the justice about to be delivered. Eddard dismounted and approached Will, meeting the man's gaze with a calm, steady demeanor. "You understand why you are here?" Eddard asked, his voice firm yet compassionate. Will nodded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Aye, my lord. I broke my oath. I know the penalty." Before the sentence was carried out, Will's eyes darted around, seeking a moment of connection. "Before you do it, my lord, I must tell you. I saw them. The White Walkers. They're real. Please, send word to my mother. Let her know I thought of her." Eddard's brow furrowed, but before he could raise ice, Lehman stepped forward, his expression a mix of determination and respect. "Father," Lehman said, his voice steady, "may I carry out the sentence?" "I am ready." Eddard regarded his second-born son, noting the resolve in his eyes. After a moment of contemplation, he nodded. "Very well, Lehman. It is your right." Lehman unsheathed his own sword, Mjolnir, a blade forged from Stark steel, a unique alloy of Valyrian steel that Lehman had developed through his attempts to reforge the ancient sword Red Ring. The blue, shimmering blade bore the craftsmanship of countless hours, a testament to Lehman's skill and innovation. Kneeling before Will, Lehman offered the man a chance to speak his last words. Will took a deep breath, his voice trembling slightly as he continued. "They move in the night, with cold in their wake. The walkers, they'll come for us all. Remember that." Lehman listened intently, his face impassive but respectful. When Will had finished, Lehman nodded and said softly, "May you find peace in the next life." With a swift, clean motion, Mjolnir struck true, ending Will's life in an instant. Bran, who had never before witnessed an execution, stood with wide eyes. Though young, he did not flinch, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. Jon Snow, standing beside him, placed a reassuring hand on Bran's shoulder. "You did well, Bran," Jon said quietly, a note of pride in his voice. As they prepared to return to Winterfell, Bran's curiosity got the better of him. He turned to his father, his voice small but insistent. "Father, what did he mean about the White Walkers? Are they real?" Eddard looked down at his youngest son, his expression softening. "The White Walkers are but stories, Bran. Tales from a time long past. They've been gone for centuries." What Will said was the rambling of a man broken by fear. Bran pondered this, then looked up at Lehman, his eyes searching for understanding. "Why did you let him talk about the White Walkers if they're not real?" Lehman met his brother's gaze, his voice calm and reflective. "Because it gave him peace in his final moments. Sometimes, listening to a man's fears can bring him some comfort, even if those fears seem unfounded." As the party mounted their horses and began the journey back to Winterfell, the silence was punctuated by the rhythmic clopping of hooves on the frozen ground. The ride back to Winterfell was uneventful until the party came upon a startling sight on the road. A large stag lay dead, its body partially disemboweled, its blood staining the snow around it. The stark contrast of crimson against white was a macabre tableau, drawing the attention of everyone in the group. Theon Greyjoy, ever quick with a theory, leaned forward on his horse, his brow furrowed. "Must have been a mountain lion," he suggested, gesturing to the carcass. Eddard Stark, his gaze sharp and assessing, shook his head. "No mountain lions live in these parts," he replied, his voice thoughtful. "Something else did this." The party dismounted, spreading out to search for clues. It wasn't long before they found the source, a dire wolf, rare and majestic, lying nearly lifeless in the snow. The creature's silver-gray fur was matted with blood, and a broken piece of stag antler was lodged cruelly in her throat. Her breaths came in shallow, labored gasps, and beside her huddled 5 tiny pups, their eyes barely open, seeking warmth from their dying mother. Eddard's face was a mask of sorrow and resolve. "It would be kinder to end their suffering," he said quietly, drawing his sword. "They will starve without her." Before he could act, Robb and Jon stepped forward, their expressions earnest and determined. "Father, Rob began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "This is an omen. The direwolf is the sigil of our house. We can't ignore this." Jon nodded in agreement, his gray eyes pleading. "They're meant to be ours. Let us care for them." As their words hung in the air, Leman dismounted without a word. He moved toward the dire wolf with a quiet grace, his every step measured. Kneeling beside the creature, he gently caressed her neck, his touch soft and soothing. The dire wolf, despite her pain, gave a small whine, her golden eyes locking onto Leman's. The others watched in silence as Leman tore off his cloak, revealing the rich, dark fur lining within, and began bandaging the direwolf's wounds with practiced precision. His hood was pulled low, shadowing his face, but beneath its cover, his eyes glowed with an ethereal blue light, a subtle radiance that no one else could see. His hands moved with a deftness that seemed almost otherworldly, each motion imbued with an unspoken connection to the dying creature. Minutes passed, each one heavy with anticipation. Finally, Leman stood, his task complete. He turned to his father, his voice calm but firm. "She will live," he declared. "Let us keep them, father. We can raise the pups, and I will care for the mother." Eddard looked at his sons, noting the unified hope in their expressions. Bran, wide-eyed and silent, gazed up at him with a look of pure longing. Eddard's heart softened, the weight of his children's belief swaying his resolve. "Very well," he conceded, his voice a mix of caution and affection. "But know this, they are your responsibility. You will feed them, care for them, and if one should die, you will bury it yourselves." Relief and excitement washed over the group, and they began preparing to transport the pups and their mother back to Winterfell. Just as they were about to leave, Jon's sharp eyes caught a movement in the snow. A few paces away, nestled beneath a bush, was a sixth pup, a runt, smaller than the others, with fur as white as the snow around it. The pup's eyes, a piercing red, marked it as an albino. Theon, never one to miss an opportunity for a jab, smirked and said, "That one's yours, Snow." The runt for the bastard. Jon, unfazed by Theon's mocking tone, approached the pup with care. He scooped the small creature into his arms, cradling it against his chest. "I'll take him," Jon said softly, a bond already forming between him and the tiny dire wolf. When the party returned to Winterfell, the cold air seemed to lift slightly, welcoming them back to the familiar embrace of the ancient castle. The pups nestled in their arms, the Stark children dismounted with care, already forming bonds with their newfound companions. Leman carried the mother dire wolf, now named Lupa, her breathing steady but shallow, as they crossed the threshold into the courtyard. Lady Catelyn Stark awaited them, her expression a blend of relief at their return and concern for the news she bore. As Eddard approached, her gaze locked with his, and she delivered the somber tidings. "Jon Arryn is dead," she said softly, her voice laced with sorrow. The words hit Eddard like a blow, his usually stoic demeanor cracking for a brief moment. Jon Arryn had been more than a mentor. He had been a father figure during Ned's youth at the Eyrie. The news of his death brought a deep, personal loss, one that Eddard would carry with a heavy heart. Catelyn continued, her tone urgent. "King Robert rides for Winterfell, along with much of the royal court. He'll be here within days." Eddard's mind raced, piecing together the implications. Robert Baratheon, his oldest friend, and the king of the Seven Kingdoms, would not undertake such a journey lightly. The only reason for such a visit was clear. Robert intended to name Eddard the new hand of the king, a role that had claimed Jon Arryn's life. Eddard's heart sank at the thought. His place was here, in the north, where his family needed him. The burden of the south was one he did not wish to bear. Later, in the privacy of his solar, Eddard shared his concerns with Catelyn. "My duty is to Winterfell," he said, his voice low but firm. "The south is a nest of vipers. I do not wish to leave our children unprotected." Catelyn, ever pragmatic, touched his hand gently. "You are a man of honor, Ned. Robert trusts you. If he asks, can you refuse?" As Eddard wrestled with his decision, Robb, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, paced in his chambers. His brow furrowed in frustration as he muttered to himself, "Why didn't my ravens inform me of this? How did such important news slip past them?" Over the following weeks, life at Winterfell continued, though the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The Stark children grew accustomed to their rapidly growing dire wolves, each one forming a unique bond with their companion. Lehman named the mother dire wolf Lupa, after the she-wolf of legend, and tended to her with unwavering dedication. Robb's wolf, Grey Wind, quickly became a loyal shadow, following his master with an intensity that matched Robb's own fierce nature. Sansa, ever the lady, named her wolf Lady, a reflection of her own aspirations for grace and nobility. Arya, in contrast, chose the name Nymeria for her wolf, after the warrior queen who led her people to a new home. Jon, with his quiet strength, named his albino wolf Ghost, for his silent, spectral presence. Bran, who found comfort in the warmth of his wolf's golden fur, called his Summer, a hopeful name amidst the ever-present chill of the north. Even young Rickon, with his boundless energy, named his wolf Shaggy Dog, a reflection of his own wild spirit. The dire wolves, once helpless pups, grew rapidly, their presence becoming a natural part of the castle's life. Their loyalty to their human companions was undeniable, and the bond between Stark and Wolf deepened with each passing day. Yet, the days were not without their challenges. Bran, ever the adventurer, was often found scaling the rooftops of Winterfell, his agile form darting across the heights with fearless abandon. Catelyn caught him one afternoon, her heart pounding at the sight of her son perched precariously on a ledge. "Bran, you must stop this. It's dangerous." Bran, with his innocent smile and sparkling eyes, promised to cease his climbing, but Catelyn knew her son too well. The promise was one he would not keep, his adventurous spirit too strong to be tamed by mere words. As the days shortened and the preparations for the royal visit intensified, Winterfell buzzed with activity. The castle was cleaned and adorned, stores were stocked, and every member of the household prepared for the arrival of the king and his court. The impending visit loomed like a storm on the horizon, a harbinger of change that none could ignore. Winterfell had never seemed so alive. Servants rushed through the halls with arms full of fabrics and silver, their hurried footsteps echoing off the ancient stone. The smell of freshly baked bread and roasted meats filled the air, mingling with the crisp scent of pine brought in from the godswood. Even the very walls seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the castle itself knew that the greatest men of the realm were soon to walk its halls. Sansa stood by the window of her chambers, watching the courtyards below, where men in Stark colors prepared for the arrival of the royal party. Groomsmen hurried to groom the finest horses, stable boys scurried to make space for the mounts of the king's knights, and the cooks in the kitchens must have been working day and night to prepare a feast fit for royalty. A feast for the king. Her heart fluttered at the thought, her hands tightening around the soft fabric of the dress she wore. It was one of her finer gowns, a deep blue that made her hair seem redder, her skin fairer. Her mother had promised she would have a new one in time for the royal feast, something elegant, fit for a lady of Winterfell. Perhaps a shade of Tully blue, embroidered with silver threads. She wanted to be perfect when she saw the king's court for the first time. More than that, she wanted to be perfect for him, Prince Joffrey. Sansa knew very little about Joffrey Baratheon, but what she knew was enough to set her heart aflame. He was tall, the ladies of Winterfell who had seen him in King's Landing had said. Handsome, golden-haired, like his mother, Queen Cersei. And most important of all, he was a prince who would one day be king. Her future was unfolding before her. She was certain of it. She had read too many stories, sung too many songs, not to recognize fate when it stood before her. Noble ladies were meant to wed gallant princes, just as queens were meant to rule beside their kings. And she, Sansa Stark, daughter of Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, was meant for greatness. She imagined it all so vividly, the courtship, the betrothal, the wedding. Would Joffrey smile when he saw her? Would he take her hand as they danced? Would he whisper soft words in her ear, as the lords and ladies of court watched them with envy? She had dreamed of it 1,000 times. Robb laughed when she spoke of it, dismissing her stories as foolish things. Arya, of course, had nothing kind to say about it at all. Who would want to marry some Lannister prince? Arya had scoffed, wrinkling her nose. He'll be soft as silk and twice as useless. He's not a Lannister, Sansa had snapped back, folding her arms. He's a Baratheon. He'll be king one day. So what? Arya had huffed. He'll still be a useless prancing lord. I'd rather marry a Sellsword. Sansa had shuddered at the thought. She would not let Arya ruin this moment for her. She knew what a proper lady was meant to do, and if anyone understood, it was Leman. Leman was the only one of her siblings who never scoffed at her dreams, never rolled his eyes when she spoke of knights and tournaments and golden-haired princes. He never teased her for her love of songs or her embroidered handkerchiefs. He listened. He understood. Leman had always been different from their other brothers. If Robb was the wolf in command, noble and dutiful, and Jon was the shadow who skulked at the edges, Leman was the fox in the wood, sharp-eyed and clever. He was younger than her by a year, but sometimes it felt as though he were older, as though he saw things in ways the rest of them didn't. He was always thinking, always planning, his mind 1,000 steps ahead of the world. Sansa didn't always understand the way his mind worked, the way he would disappear into his training with his Volca Fenrica, those men who followed him so loyally. But he understood her. "You think too much about tomorrow, Sansa," he had told her once, when she had spoken of her dreams of being a princess and of courtly love. "The future will come, whether you're ready or not." "And what do you think my future will be then?" she had asked, lifting her chin. "A bright one," he had said, smiling, "if you learn how to shape it." Sansa held on to those words like a talisman. The day the royal party arrived, Winterfell shook with the thunder of hooves. Sansa stood beside her family on the stone steps of the keep, her hands clasped in front of her as the banners of the crown came into view. Gold and crimson, the stag and lion. Her heart hammered in her chest as the procession entered the courtyard. So many knights, so many lords, so many horses gleaming like polished steel in the sunlight. And then she saw him, Joffrey Baratheon. He rode near the front, his golden hair shining, his posture regal and composed. His armor was polished to perfection, his deep crimson cloak trimmed with fine gold embroidery. He looked every inch the prince she had imagined. Sansa's breath caught in her throat. "He's beautiful," she whispered. Leman, standing beside her, glanced at her with an unreadable expression, but he said nothing. The king dismounted with all the grandeur of a warrior king, embracing her father with an ease that spoke of old friendship. Queen Cersei followed, her beauty cold and perfect, her gaze sweeping over Winterfell as if assessing its worth. And then came the rest of the Lannisters, and the lords of the South, and Joffrey. Sansa barely heard the words of introduction being spoken. Her heart was pounding too loudly. She met his gaze for the first time as he dismounted, as he turned to survey the Starks before him. His green eyes flickered over her, briefly, before moving on. But it was enough. A shiver ran through her. This was the moment her life would change. This was the beginning of her story. The crisp northern air was heavy with anticipation as the people of Winterfell gathered in the courtyard, their breaths forming visible puffs in the chill. The stone walls loomed high, casting long shadows across the crowd that had assembled to witness the arrival of the royal party. The Stark banners, emblazoned with the dire wolf sigil, fluttered gently in the light breeze, adding a somber grandeur to the scene. In the throng, Arya Stark, ever the restless spirit, fidgeted impatiently. Unlike her sister, Sansa, who stood still and composed with the grace expected of a noble lady, Arya's mind wandered, her gaze flitting between the assembled knights and the heavy gates. When the distant sound of hooves echoed across the courtyard, signaling the approach of King Robert's entourage, the crowd fell silent, save for Arya's whispered commentary, which earned her a sharp glare from Sansa. "Be quiet, Arya," Sansa hissed, her tone a blend of annoyance and embarrassment. "You're supposed to be respectful." Arya rolled her eyes, but relented, focusing her attention on the gates, which creaked open to reveal the procession. King Robert Baratheon rode at the forefront, his robust frame barely contained by the black and gold tunic that bore the sigil of House Baratheon. His crown, a circlet of gold with a hint of stag antlers, caught the pale northern sun, casting a warm glint over his bearded face. His knights, clad in shining armor, followed in formation, their banners fluttering as their steeds trotted in unison. Behind the king, a grand wheelhouse, adorned with the colors of House Lannister, lumbered into view. The curtains fluttered slightly, hinting at the presence of Queen Cersei Lannister within. The sight of the opulent carriage was a stark contrast to the rugged, unyielding landscape of the north. Lord Eddard Stark, clad in the furs and leathers befitting the Warden of the North, stepped forward to greet his old friend. His solemn demeanor softened into a rare smile as Robert dismounted with a grunt, wrapping Eddard in a bear-like embrace. Their camaraderie was palpable, a bond forged in the fires of rebellion and tempered by years of shared hardship. "It's been too long, Ned," Robert boomed, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Too long indeed, Your Grace," Eddard replied, a hint of warmth in his otherwise stoic tone. As the formalities were observed, Robert's gaze drifted towards the great keep of Winterfell. He clapped a heavy hand on Eddard's shoulder, his jovial expression giving way to something more somber. "Take me to her," he said simply. Eddard inclined his head. This way. The descent into the crypts of Winterfell was a somber procession. The air grew cooler, and the torches lining the passage flickered, casting elongated shadows on the ancient stone walls. The scent of earth and stone was pervasive, mingling with the faintest hint of decay. Eddard led Robert to the tomb of Lyanna Stark, his heart heavy with the weight of memory. The statue of Lyanna, carved in her likeness, stood serenely atop her tomb, her hands clasped around a stone rose. Robert's expression softened, his rough exterior giving way to a tender sorrow as he knelt beside her, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. "She deserved better," Robert murmured, his voice thick with regret. "Every night, in my dreams, I kill Rhaegar anew. It's never enough." Eddard stood silently for a moment before responding, his voice low and steady. "Rhaegar is gone. House Targaryen is no more." "Not all of them," Robert said, his eyes dark with a lingering hatred. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken memories, the air thick with the weight of shared loss. After a moment, Robert rose, his hand lingering on the tomb. He turned to Eddard, his expression hardening once more. "I need you, Ned," Robert said, his voice resolute. "I want you to be my hand." Eddard's brow furrowed, the enormity of the request pressing down on him. "It's a great honor, Your Grace. I will need time to consider." Robert nodded, a slight smile breaking the tension. "Take your time, but consider this, my son, Joffrey, and your daughter, Sansa. A union between our houses." The words hung in the air, a calculated offer that carried both promise and peril. Later, the great hall of Winterfell was alive with the sounds of merriment. The feast was a lavish affair, with tables laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, and goblets of wine. The torches cast a warm glow over the gathering, illuminating the faces of nobles and commoners alike. Queen Cersei, resplendent in green and gold, exchanged polite words with Lady Catelyn Stark, their conversation a delicate dance of civility. Cersei's gaze lingered on Sansa, who sat demurely beside her mother, her auburn hair catching the firelight. The queen's lips curled into a faint smile. "She's a beauty," Cersei remarked. "She'll be the star of the court," she forced herself to say politely. "If she ever makes it there, that is. How dare you think I'd let my son marry a northern savage? He will marry Myrcella, so that only pure Lannister blood remains on the throne. Like me and Jaime." Unknowing of the queen's inner thoughts, Catelyn smiled, pride evident in her expression. "Sansa has always been excellent. I couldn't have wished for a better daughter." Sansa Stark had always dreamed of a life at court, filled with grandeur and romance. From the tales she read in her childhood to the songs sung by minstrels, the idea of marrying a handsome prince and becoming a queen seemed the pinnacle of her dreams. Yet, as she found herself in conversation with Prince Joffrey Baratheon, her excitement began to wane, replaced by a gnawing sense of disillusionment. At first, Sansa was enchanted by Joffrey's appearance. He was tall and golden-haired, with the striking features of his Lannister lineage. His clothes were of the finest silk, and he carried himself with an air of regal confidence. But it did not take long for Sansa to notice the flaws that lay beneath his polished exterior. The more they spoke, the more she realized how far removed Joffrey was from the gallant prince she had imagined. Joffrey's arrogance was evident in every word he spoke. He boasted about his future reign with an unearned certainty, as if the crown were already perched upon his head. He spoke of his greatness, of how the realm would flourish under his rule, yet there was no substance to his claims, no evidence of wisdom, strength, or compassion. It was all bluster, inflated by his own self-importance. Sansa listened with growing discomfort, as Joffrey outlined his views on women. A woman's duty, he declared with a dismissive wave, is to be obedient to her husband and provide him with heirs. That is the highest honor she can achieve. The word struck Sansa like a blow. She had been raised on tales of noble ladies who were not just wives and mothers, but also advisors, warriors, and rulers in their own right. Her own mother, Catelyn Stark, was a woman of great strength and wisdom, a pillar of support for her father, Eddard. And then there was Arya, her fierce younger sister, who would scoff at such a notion. Even her father's bastard, Jon Snow, had shown more respect and understanding towards people than Joffrey seemed capable of. The more Joffrey spoke, the more Sansa's mind wandered to Jon. Despite his illegitimate birth, Jon possessed qualities that Sansa found admirable. He was kind, dutiful, and honorable. He treated people with respect, as equals rather than subordinates. How could it be, Sansa wondered with growing frustration, that a bastard like Jon could outshine the crown prince in every aspect that mattered? The comparison was inevitable and damning. Joffrey's conceit extended beyond his views on women. He reveled in tales of his own exploits, though it became clear to Sansa that these were nothing more than instances of cruelty masked as heroism. He spoke of hunting down animals too weak to defend themselves, of punishing servants for the slightest perceived slight, and of his disdain for those he deemed inferior. There was no honor in his actions, no chivalry or nobility. Only a spoiled boy who wielded power without understanding its true purpose. Sansa's heart sank as she realized that Joffrey was everything she had been taught to despise. He was selfish, cruel, and utterly devoid of empathy. He acted as though the world owed him reverence simply because of his birthright, and it grated on her every time he opened his mouth. His laugh was a hollow, grating sound, and his smile never reached his eyes. Inwardly, Sansa despaired. She had once envisioned her future as a queen by Joffrey's side, a role she had thought would be the fulfillment of her dreams. But the reality was far different, and the thought of binding her life to his was becoming unbearable. How could she, a daughter of House Stark, align herself with someone who was the antithesis of everything her family stood for? Honor, duty, and compassion were values her father had instilled in her, values that Joffrey seemed incapable of comprehending. As the hours passed, Sansa's resolve hardened. She could not, under any circumstances, allow this betrothal to proceed. To marry Joffrey would be to betray her own values, to forsake the lessons her parents had taught her. The very idea of it was repulsive, a blight upon her soul. Sansa knew that she would have to find a way to voice her concerns, to convince her father that this union was not in her best interest, or the realm's. She could not afford to be meek, to let herself be swept along by the tides of political ambition. She had to stand firm, to protect not just herself, but the ideals she held dear. The tension in the great hall of Winterfell was palpable as the feast continued late into the night. The air was thick with the mingling aromas of roasted meats and spiced wine, and the din of laughter and conversation filled the vast space. Yet, for Sansa Stark, the lively atmosphere had long since lost its charm. Her attention was fixed on Prince Joffrey, who had grown increasingly intoxicated with each passing goblet of wine. At first, Joffrey's behavior had been tolerable, if not entirely pleasant. He had boasted of his imagined exploits and lavished Sansa with hollow compliments, none of which stirred any real emotion in her. But as the evening wore on, his tongue loosened by the wine, Joffrey's words took a darker turn. He leaned closer to Sansa, his breath reeking of alcohol, and with a smug grin, he uttered, "You, my dear, are a flower among savages." Sansa's stomach turned at the twisted attempt at flattery. There was nothing genuine in his words, only a condescending tone that set her teeth on edge. But before she could muster a response, Joffrey continued, his voice slurring slightly. "The North, it's filled with savage barbarians. You don't belong here, Sansa. You're too delicate, too refined for such a place." Her fingers tightened around the goblet in her hand, her knuckles turning white. How dare he? She thought, fury simmering beneath her composed exterior. To disparage her homeland, her people, in such a cavalier manner was an insult she could scarcely endure. But Joffrey wasn't finished. Fueled by his drunken bravado, Joffrey's insults grew bolder, more personal. He sneered as he spoke of her family, his words laced with disdain. Your father, your brothers, they're uncultured, unfit to be in the presence of true nobility. And that bastard brother of yours, Leman, what a lucky runt. He should have died to Lord Drum. He doesn't deserve to be a knight. Everything he's achieved? Pure luck. The final blow landed with the force of a sledgehammer. Sansa felt her blood boil, her vision narrowing as the weight of his words pressed down on her. Joffrey had crossed a line, one she could not forgive. It was one thing to be arrogant and conceited, but to openly insult her people, her family, her brother in her presence? It was an unforgivable transgression. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a drum of rising fury. She clenched her jaw, struggling to maintain her composure. The urge to lash out, to scream at the insolent boy before her, to strangle the arrogant bastard for spewing such words was overwhelming. But she knew that such an outburst would not only be unbecoming of her, but also give him more ammunition, more reason to belittle her and her family. With a measured breath, Sansa rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and controlled. "If you'll excuse me, Your Grace," she said, her voice icy with barely restrained anger. She turned on her heel, her skirts swishing around her ankles as she made her way out of the hall, her head held high. The cold air of the courtyard was a welcome relief as she stepped outside, the quiet night a stark contrast to the chaos within. Sansa's hands trembled with the effort it took to restrain herself, to suppress the overwhelming desire to return to the hall and give Joffrey a piece of her mind, or worse. But she knew better. She had to be smarter, more composed. Unbeknownst to Sansa, Joffrey's venomous words were not entirely his own. He had been parroting the sentiments of his mother, Queen Cersei Lannister. Cersei, ever insecure and envious of the Starks' growing influence, often spoke ill of them, particularly of Leman Stark. Leman's rise to knighthood and his many victories were a constant reminder of her own family's perceived shortcomings, and she couldn't bear the thought of being overshadowed by the Northerners. Joffrey, impressionable and eager to please his mother, had internalized her words, regurgitating them with a cruelty that was all his own. As Sansa stood in the chill of the northern night, her resolve solidified. She could not, would not, tie her fate to a boy like Joffrey. He was everything she detested, arrogant, cruel, and utterly lacking in honor. Her family, her people, deserved her loyalty and respect. They were not savages. They were her foundation, her strength. And she would not betray them by aligning herself with someone who saw them as anything less. Her decision was strengthened even more. Sansa would find a way to break the betrothal, to escape the clutches of a future that promised nothing but misery. The prince might have the crown, but it was clear to Sansa that he was no king, and she would not be his queen under any circumstance. Suddenly, she heard the clanging of steel, undoubtedly a clash of blades taking place. She went to look for who was making the ruckus at this hour. The distant clamor of the feast echoed faintly through the stone corridors of Winterfell, but Jon Snow paid it little mind. Outside, under the pale light of the moon, he worked tirelessly at his sword practice. The chill of the northern night bit at his skin, but he welcomed the cold. It was a familiar companion, one that dulled the sting of emotions roiling within him. Each swing of his sword, each precise movement, was a release of the anger and frustration he felt. Jon's exclusion from the feast was not a surprise. Lady Catelyn Stark had made her feelings about his presence clear. Appearances had to be kept up. A bastard did not belong among nobles, especially not at a royal gathering. The words had been unspoken, but Jon had read them in her cold gaze, in the stiff set of her mouth. He was used to it, the quiet scorn and veiled looks. Yet, tonight, it stung more than usual. Lost in his thoughts, Jon didn't hear the soft footfalls approaching until a familiar voice broke the silence. "Still at it, Jon?" Jon lowered his sword and turned to see his uncle, Benjen Stark, standing a few paces away. The first ranger of the Night's Watch, clad in dark leathers, looked every bit the seasoned ranger he was. His eyes, sharp and discerning, studied Jon with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Uncle Benjen," Jon greeted, sheathing his sword. "I didn't hear you." Benjen approached, his footsteps crunching softly on the frozen ground. "A lot on your mind, I take it?" Jon nodded, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. "Lady Stark thought it would be inappropriate for me to attend the feast," he said bitterly. I'm a bastard, after all. Benjen's expression softened. Jon, you know it's not a reflection of your worth. Caitlin, she's a good woman, but her feelings about you have always been complicated. Jon's gaze dropped to the ground, his fingers curling into fists. I don't belong here, he muttered. Not in Winterfell, not at that feast. Benjen placed a reassuring hand on Jon's shoulder. You belong where you choose to belong, Jon. If you want to find a place where names and birth mean nothing, perhaps the wall is where you should be. Jon looked up, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. Take me with you, uncle. When you return to the wall, take me with you. Benjen hesitated, the weight of Jon's request evident in his expression. It's a hard life, Jon. The wall isn't a refuge, it's a duty. But if you're certain it's what you want, I'll consider it. Before Jon could respond, another voice joined the conversation, light and tinged with wry amusement. A bastard yearning for the wall. How poetic. Both Jon and Benjen turned to see Tyrion Lannister approaching, his short stature and sharp features unmistakable. The dwarf moved with a certain grace, despite the uneven gait caused by his malformed legs. His eyes, keen and intelligent, sparkled with curiosity as he surveyed the scene. Tyrion, Benjen greeted with a nod. Jon, however, bristled at the interruption. He had little patience for the sharp-tongued Lannister, especially tonight. What do you want? He asked tersely. Tyrion raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on his lips. To offer a bit of advice, if you'll allow it. Jon folded his arms across his chest, his expression guarded. I'm not interested in advice. Ah, but you might find it useful, Tyrion said, stepping closer. You see, I couldn't help but overhear. You're pricklish about being a bastard, aren't you? Quick to take offense. Jon's jaw tightened. What would you know about it? Tyrion's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. More than you might think. All dwarfs are bastards in their father's eyes. The words hung in the air, heavy with a truth that Jon hadn't considered. Tyrion's gaze was steady, unflinching. There was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. You can't change what you are, Tyrion continued. A bastard, a dwarf, it doesn't matter. But you can change how you perceive it. Wear it like armor, Jon Snow. Let it be a shield against those who would use it to hurt you. If you own it, no one can use it against you. Jon stared at Tyrion, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't the kind of advice he had expected, but there was a truth to it that resonated with him. Slowly, he nodded, the anger in his chest easing just a little. Thank you, Jon said quietly. Tyrion inclined his head. Remember, Jon, never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Make it your strength. With that, Tyrion turned and walked away, leaving Jon and Benjen standing in the cold night air. Jon's mind churned with new thoughts, the seeds of a different perspective taking root. Perhaps there was a way to rise above his circumstances, to find strength in his identity rather than shame. And perhaps, just perhaps, the wall might be the place where he could truly belong. He was shaken out of his thoughts when he heard the unmistakable sound of the clashing of steel. Benjen seemed to have heard it too, so Jon began following him towards the source of the noise. The great hall of Winterfell was alive with the hum of conversation and the clatter of plates as the feast unfolded. Yet, amidst the revelry, Eddard Stark felt drawn to a quieter corner where a figure of legendary stature sat alone, nursing a goblet of wine. Ser Barristan Selmy, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, was a living legend, his exploits etched into the annals of Westerosi history. The mere presence of such a man was enough to stir awe in the hearts of many, and for Lehman, the chance to converse with him was an opportunity he could not let slip. With a respectful bow, Lehman approached. Ser Barristan, he greeted, his voice steady but laced with admiration. May I join you? The old knight looked up, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. Of course, young Stark. Sit with me. It's been too long since we've spoken. Lehman settled into the chair beside him, his heart beating a little faster. The weight of history sat next to him, and he was eager to soak in whatever wisdom the knight might impart. It's an honor to speak with you again, Ser. Your deeds are legendary, stories I grew up hearing with wonder. Barristan chuckled softly, the sound of a man who had long grown used to such praise. His eyes crinkled at the corners, a mix of humility and fondness. You flatter me, lad. I'm just an old knight who's been fortunate enough to survive more battles than most. He paused, his gaze sharpening as he studied Lehman. But you are the new star of the realm. I remember that day vividly, an 8-year-old boy, covered in blood, standing tall with red rain in his hand, and Lord Drum dead at his feet. I wanted to knight you right then and there. Lehman felt a flush rise to his cheeks, his humility prompting a modest response. You honor me with your words, sire. I was lucky that day. Barristan's smile deepened, a twinkle of respect in his eyes. Luck favors the brave, Lehman, and bravery is something you have in abundance. Lehman, eager to shift the focus, leaned forward, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. You say you've merely survived battles, but what battles they were. The Battle of the Trident, the defiance of Duskendale. Your name is synonymous with valor and honor. The mention of those events brought a shadow of melancholy to Barristan's gaze. Those were hard times, Lehman. War is never as glorious as the songs make it out to be. It's blood and death, suffering and loss. Something I know you've experienced firsthand. Lehman nodded solemnly, the weight of shared experience settling between them. Still, to stand for something, to protect the innocent, that's what makes it worth it, doesn't it? Barristan's smile returned, tinged with pride. Aye, that's what we fight for. To protect those who cannot protect themselves. To uphold honor, even when the world around us crumbles. It's the duty of a knight, a duty I see you've embraced. The two men lapsed into a comfortable silence, the cacophony of the feast fading into the background as they shared a moment of reflection. Lehman's mind churned with questions, the desire to learn from the legendary knight burning within him. Sir Barristan, Lehman ventured, his voice tinged with hesitance. I've always wondered, what does it take to become a knight of your caliber? Barristan regarded him with a thoughtful gaze, the wisdom of years etched into his expression. It takes more than skill with a sword, Lehman. It takes dedication, discipline, and an unwavering sense of duty. A knight must serve, must be willing to lay down his life for others. And he must never forget the oaths he's sworn, for they are the foundation of his honor. Lehman absorbed the words, the gravity of them settling over him like a mantle. I wish I could have learned from you, sir. To be your squire, to learn the ways of knighthood from the greatest of them all. Barristan's smile softened, a hint of regret in his eyes. And I would have been proud to have you as my squire, Lehman. You have the heart of a true knight, and that is something that cannot be taught. It's a shame we did not have that chance, but seeing the man you've become, I have no doubt you've learned well. The mutual respect between them was palpable, a bond forged in shared values and a commitment to the ideals of knighthood. Lehman felt a surge of pride at the knight's words, a validation of the path he had chosen. Perhaps we can still learn from each other, Lehman suggested, a spark of excitement lighting his eyes. Would you honor me with a spar? It would be a privilege to test my mettle against a legend. Barristan's eyes lit up, a gleam of youthful enthusiasm shining through. A spar, you say? It's been some time since I've had a proper one. I accept your challenge, Eddard Stark. Let's see how the boy who bested Lord Drum has improved. They rose from their seats, the anticipation of the coming match energizing them both. As they made their way to the training grounds, the feast continued unabated. But for Lehman and Barristan, the world had narrowed to the thrill of the upcoming spar, a meeting of old mastery and emerging prowess, a dance of swords that promised to be as instructive as it was exhilarating. The training grounds were dimly lit by the soft glow of the moon, casting long shadows across the worn earth. Eddard Stark and Sir Barristan Selmy stood opposite each other, the cool night air charged with anticipation. The sounds of the feast echoed faintly in the distance, but here, amidst the quiet of the courtyard, the only noise was the soft rustle of the wind and the steady breathing of the two combatants. Lehman's hand rested lightly on the hilt of Mjolnir, the sword he had forged from the famed Red Rain. The bluish blade gleamed faintly, its edge honed to a deadly sharpness. Opposite him, Barristan Selmy drew his own sword with practiced ease, the steel singing softly as it left the scabbard. The old knight's stance was relaxed yet poised, a testament to decades of experience on the battlefield. For a moment, they simply stood there, sizing each other up. Then, with a nod of mutual respect, they began. Lehman moved first, stepping forward with a swift, controlled strike aimed at Barristan's shoulder. The older knight parried effortlessly, turning the blade aside with a flick of his wrist. The sound of steel on steel rang out, crisp and clear in the night air. Barristan countered with a quick thrust, testing Lehman's reflexes. Lehman sidestepped, bringing Jalner around in a sweeping arc that forced Barristan to retreat a step. Their swords met again, the clash of metal echoing in the quiet courtyard. The tempo of the spar increased as they fell into a rhythm, trading blows with growing intensity. Lehman's strikes were precise and forceful, his youth and strength evident in every movement. Barristan, however, moved with a grace that belied his age, his swordplay a masterful blend of offense and defense. Lehman launched a series of quick slashes, each one aimed at probing Barristan's defenses. The old knight met each attack with calm efficiency, his sword a blur as he deflected and redirected the younger man's strikes. Barristan's footwork was impeccable, each step measured and deliberate, allowing him to maintain perfect balance and control. As the spar continued, sweat began to bead on Lehman's brow. He adjusted his grip on Jalner, shifting his stance to launch a powerful overhand strike. Barristan raised his sword to block, the force of the impact sending a jarring vibration through both blades. Undeterred, Lehman pressed the attack, following up with a quick feint and a low cut aimed at Barristan's leg. Barristan anticipated the move, twisting his body to avoid the blade and countering with a quick slash aimed at Lehman's side. Lehman twisted away, narrowly avoiding the strike, and brought Jalner up in a defensive arc to deflect the follow-up thrust. The two circled each other, their swords weaving an intricate dance of steel. Unbeknownst to the combatants locked in their fierce duel, Sansa Stark had wandered into the courtyard, her footsteps light and tentative on the cobblestones. The rhythmic clanging of steel against steel had drawn her from her chambers, a siren call that stirred something deep within her. As she neared the edge of the training grounds, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as she beheld the sight before her. There, illuminated by the silvery glow of the moon, stood her brother Lehman, locked in a graceful yet intense dance of blades with the legendary knight, Barristan Selmy. Sansa's heart fluttered with a mix of pride and awe. Lehman moved with a ferocity she knew well, his every strike imbued with a youthful energy that seemed almost otherworldly, weaving and dodging strikes while delivering crushing blows with his blade. His style was like a raging blizzard, threatening to swallow any who dared to stand against it. Yet it was not just Lehman who captivated her, but Ser Barristan too. The old knight's movements were like poetry in motion, each swing and parry a masterpiece of discipline and experience. Sansa had heard the tales of Barristan Selmy, the bold and gallant knight of the Kingsguard, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. The sheer beauty of their duel, the interplay of strength and skill, left her rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the combatants. The soft sound of footsteps echoed behind her, and one by one, others began to gather, drawn by the mesmerizing clash. Benjen Stark, the ever-watchful ranger of the Night's Watch, approached silently, his expression one of measured interest. He crossed his arms over his chest, his piercing eyes narrowing as he assessed the combatants with a practiced gaze. There was a glimmer of approval in his eyes as he watched Lehman, a proud uncle recognizing the growing prowess of his kin. Jon Snow followed close behind, his dark curls tousled by the cool night breeze. His expression was a blend of admiration and a hint of envy, his eyes flicking between his brother and the famed knight. Jon had trained diligently under the watchful eye of Ser Roderick Castle, yet the sheer mastery displayed by Barristan was something else entirely. He watched, spellbound, his hand unconsciously resting on the hilt of Longclaw, as if yearning to join in the fray. Catelyn Stark appeared next, her steps more measured and cautious. Her gaze softened as she took in the sight of her son, pride swelling in her chest. Yet there was also a trace of worry in her eyes, the innate concern of a mother watching her child engage in combat, even in practice. She stood beside Sansa, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's shoulder, offering silent reassurance as they both watched the duel unfold. Arya Stark, ever the rebel, darted into the courtyard with barely contained excitement. Her gray eyes sparkled with admiration as she took in the spectacle. She clutched the training sword at her side, her fingers itching to mimic the fluid, deadly movements she saw before her. Arya had always yearned for the life of a warrior, and watching Barristan Selmy, one of the greatest knights alive, was like witnessing a dream come to life. She edged closer, her young heart pounding with exhilaration, her breath quickening as each clash of swords sent sparks flying. The quiet murmurs of the gathering crowd were interrupted by the soft, measured footfalls of Jaime Lannister. Draped in a cloak of white, the Kingslayer moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He leaned casually against a nearby pillar, his golden hair catching the moonlight, his keen eyes fixed on the duel with an almost predatory intensity. Jaime's expression was inscrutable, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he observed the fight. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a flicker of genuine admiration for the skill displayed by both combatants. Jaime recognized mastery when he saw it, and Barristan Selmy was a knight who had earned his respect long ago, so it was baffling when Leman Stark, a boy of 17, was making Ser Barristan go all out. Something even he barely managed with great difficulty. The courtyard, now filled with silent spectators, seemed to hold its collective breath, the air thick with anticipation. The clash of swords continued unabated, each strike resonating through the night, a powerful symphony of strength and skill. The gathered Northmen, loyal to House Stark, watched with bated breath, their expressions ranging from awe to silent reverence. These men, seasoned warriors in their own right, knew the rarity of witnessing such a duel, an encounter where age and wisdom met youth and vigor in a battle as old as time itself. As the duel reached its crescendo, the gathered crowd felt the weight of history in the making, a moment etched in time, witnessed under the starlit sky. Each observer, from the noble Stark family to the lone Lannister knight, found themselves drawn into the rhythm of the duel, hearts pounding in unison with the clash of steel, each one silently rooting for their chosen champion. The combatants remained oblivious to their growing audience, wholly focused on the fight. Leman's attacks grew more aggressive, his determination to best the legendary knight pushing him to his limits. He lunged forward with a powerful thrust, aiming for Barristan's chest. Barristan sidestepped gracefully, pivoting on his heel to deliver a swift riposte that Leman barely managed to deflect. The momentum shifted as Barristan took the offensive, pressing Leman with a series of rapid strikes. Each blow was delivered with precision, forcing Leman to rely on his speed and agility to evade and parry. The older knight's experience was evident in every move, his attacks calculated and efficient, but it was clear that he wasn't holding anything back. Leman, however, was not easily outmatched. He adjusted his strategy, using feints and quick footwork to create openings. He managed to land a glancing blow on Barristan's arm, the impact causing the older knight to grunt softly in acknowledgement. Barristan responded with a swift backhand slash, catching Leman off guard and forcing him to retreat a step. Their swords met again and again, the clashing of steel a symphony of skill and strength. The duel stretched on, each combatant pushing the other to their limits. Leman's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning with exertion, but he refused to yield. Barristan's face was a mask of concentration, his movements as fluid and controlled as ever, but even he was beginning to show signs of fatigue. In the final moments of the spar, Barristan feinted left, drawing Leman's guard to the side, and then pivoted smoothly to deliver a swift strike to Leman's ribs. The flat of Barristan's blade tapped Leman's side, a clear sign of a decisive blow. Leman stepped back, raising Jalner in a gesture of surrender. The spar ended with both men breathing heavily, their swords lowered. A moment of silence hung in the air before Barristan extended his hand, a proud smile on his face. "Well fought, Leman," Barristan said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "You have the makings of a great knight." Leman grasped Barristan's hand firmly, a grin spreading across his face despite his exhaustion. "Thank you, Ser Barristan. It was an honor." As they turned to face the small crowd that had gathered, applause broke out, a mix of admiration and respect for the display of skill and honor. Sansa, Benjen, Jon, Catelyn, Arya, and the others stepped forward, their expressions a blend of pride and awe. Jaime Lannister, leaning against the pillar, gave a slow, appreciative nod, all the while wondering and partially dreading the thought of the warrior Leman would become. I hope you enjoyed. Remember to support the writer. Like, sub, and share the video for more awesome stories. See you in the next video.